Robert Baratheon sat in the high seat of the Red Keep's throne room, his broad shoulders draped in a cloak of black velvet trimmed with golden thread, the crown of the 7 kingdoms weighing upon his brow. There was a look in his eyes that no one quite recognized, neither the roguish glint of his younger years nor the dull resignation he had shown in recent days. Instead, it was as though he were standing at a precipice and had decided, in that moment, to leap headlong into an uncertain future. Word had spread quickly through the corridors. King Robert had cast off the old arrangement with House Lannister, despite the children that bound him to Cersei, and declared his intention to wed Margaery Tyrell, the blossoming rose of Highgarden. Many trembled at the potential consequences, though none so openly as Peter Baelish, Varys, and the other whisperers who thrived on secrets. They sensed the shifting of power beneath their feet. The Lannisters, after all, had stood at the pinnacle of courtly influence since the rebellion that placed Robert on the throne. But now, in a single swift move, the king threatened to uproot them, to cast them aside in favor of a new queen and, with her, a different alliance that would change the balance of the realm. He made the announcement on a bright morning, the sun streaming in through the narrow windows behind the Iron Throne. Dust motes swirled in the golden light. As he rose, the hall seemed to hold its breath. Cersei stood by his side, her spine rigid, her green eyes burning with a fury she could not voice in the open. She had heard rumors, of course. She was not foolish. She understood that her husband despised her. She also knew he was reckless. But it was one thing to endure his mistresses and his drunken insults behind closed doors. It was another thing entirely for him to publicly uproot the alliance that had given House Lannister its power. Whispers churned and frothed in the shadows, but Robert was unyielding. More than once, he had threatened to set Cersei aside, yet the entire court had expected he would simply continue on, given the reality of their marriage pact and the existence of 3 royal children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. But something had changed in Robert. Whether it was a sudden clarity, or the cunning of Mace Tyrell's words, or a final disgust for the Lannisters' seemingly endless maneuverings, he had reached his decision. On that day, he roared at the hall, proclaiming that his marriage to Cersei was to be annulled by the High Septon on grounds of deception, though he would not speak of what that deception truly was. The rumor that swirled in the wake of this pronouncement was that the children might not be his, and it took all of Cersei's carefully honed composure not to scream accusations or attempt to silence the king on the spot. She had no time to summon the members of her house, no chance to gather allies to oppose him, for Robert acted quickly. He named Tywin Lannister's position as Hand of the King to be dissolved, then turned and demanded, in the presence of all, that Mace Tyrell present his daughter for a new royal wedding. A hush fell over the courtiers, many of whom had never laid eyes upon Margaery Tyrell. She was rumored to be as beautiful as the late Lyanna Stark, or so the bards whispered in half-sung verse. An intelligent girl, well-groomed in the arts of courtesy and conversation, often overshadowed by the famed beauty and cunning of her grandmother Olenna, but no less formidable in her own right. Mace Tyrell looked like a man who had somehow stumbled upon a chasm of gold while searching for copper. He bowed low, trying to hide his triumphant smile, and when he rose, he declared his house would be honored to cement its fealty to the crown in this manner. Within a fortnight, King Robert put aside Cersei, locked her away in her chambers under heavy guard, and summoned the High Septon to finalize the new union. Across the 7 kingdoms, ravens flew from King's Landing bearing news of the sudden shift. Allies scrambled to protect their interests. Enemies weighed whether this was an opportunity to strike or a blow that would topple a seemingly unassailable house. Perhaps none were as enraged as Tywin Lannister. From his seat in Casterly Rock, he received word of his daughter's disgrace. His jaw clenched, and fury warred with cold resolve. For the moment, the king's decision, enacted within the capital's walls, was a reality Tywin could not reverse by snapping his fingers. Yet if there was one truth in Westeros, it was that Tywin Lannister never forgot an insult, and he never let it remain unanswered. The wedding itself was a spectacle. Robert emerged from his chambers cleaner and more sober than most had seen him in years. His hair, which had begun to thin at the crown, was neatly trimmed, his beard combed and oiled. The folds of his majestic garments, Baratheon black streaked with gold, were tailored to fit him, a sign of the renewed attention being paid to his appearance. Margaery Tyrell arrived at the Great September of Baelor in a litter draped with rose garlands, drawn by 6 white horses. She wore a gown of shimmering green, embroidered with gold roses that caught the sunlight, a design that complemented her slender form and evoked murmurs of admiration from the small folk and nobility alike. Many commented that she looked like spring had come again, as though she might coax new life from the ashes of the realm's battered politics. If she felt any trepidation about marrying a king decades her senior, a man known for his foul temper and endless carousing, she did not show it on her face. At the altar, the High Septon performed the rites, asking if King Robert Baratheon took this woman as his lawful wedded wife. The king's voice, loud and resounding, echoed through the space. "I do." Then he turned to Margaery, who repeated the vow, "I do," in a voice both soft and certain. Then Robert wrapped her slender shoulders in the cloak of House Baratheon, the black and gold fabric swallowing the green of her gown. He planted a kiss upon her, and the crowds cheered. The Great September erupted into the celebratory toll of bells. Tapestries showing the sigils of houses Baratheon and Tyrell had been hung for the occasion, while the crowns of the 7 kingdoms gave silent witness. Starks, Arryns, Tullys, Martells, and more had all sent their delegates to watch this momentous ceremony. For years, the Baratheon-Lannister marriage had symbolized the stability of the post-rebellion order. Now that old symbol lay in fragments, replaced with a new rose-laden promise. The feasting that followed was a grand affair, though it bore less of the ostentatious gold and red flair the Lannisters might have demanded. Instead, tables overflowed with courses of delicate fish, fresh greens, honeyed fruits, and succulent game, many of the dishes featuring floral accents favored by the Tyrells. Wine flowed freely, and Robert seemed in a rare good humor, though occasionally his gaze wandered across the hall, as if searching for a flash of Lannister gold. There was none to be found. Jaime Lannister had been summarily dismissed from the Kingsguard and sent from the capital under threat of execution if he dared remain. As for Cersei, she was nowhere to be seen, her presence an unspoken tension in the air. Tyrion Lannister, strangely enough, lingered in the city for a time, though not at the feast. He spent his nights in a wine-soaked vigil in the lower levels of the Red Keep's library, seeking comfort in dusty tomes and silent illusions of freedom. He was the only Lannister who remained, it seemed, though none knew what plans swirled in his sharp mind. Margaery played her part with practiced elegance. She danced with the king during the first official wedding dance, enduring the sweaty crush of his body with a polite, measured smile. She laughed at his jokes, guiding him gently from one corner of the hall to another so that he might greet his lords. Whenever Robert's boisterous voice rose too high, or his steps threatened to stumble, she softly placed a hand on his arm, her large brown eyes steady and kind. So well did she manage the king's tempers that the court began to whisper that perhaps she was the only one who could tame the storm that raged in Robert's heart. And if there was any disapproval from the faith, or from those who questioned the king's right to set aside his first wife, it was muted by the grandeur of the event and the broad smiles that the newly crowned queen bestowed upon everyone in attendance. In the nights that followed, the game changed irrevocably. Robert, newly wed, found a fresh sense of purpose. He summoned the small council, appointing Mace Tyrell as master of ships, a position Mace found less than perfect, as he preferred to style himself a grand strategist, but it was a seat on the council nonetheless. The king then named Renly Baratheon as Hand of the King, the younger Baratheon brother stepping into a role that once had belonged to Jon Arryn and, later, Ned Stark, and even more recently to Tywin Lannister. Renly's easy charm and political acumen had been overshadowed in the previous years by Tywin's iron presence. But now, with the Lannisters ousted, Renly stepped eagerly into the vacuum. The realm saw swift changes. Certain Lannister bannermen found themselves under scrutiny. Gold shipments from the Rock to the Crown's coffers were halted, and the new alliance with the Tyrells meant Highgarden's supplies of grain and produce bolstered King's Landing. For once, the city was not on the brink of starvation. Guards at the gates wore fresh black and gold tabards. The people of King's Landing murmured that maybe, just maybe, the new queen could soften the king's worst impulses, that perhaps a second chance at a fruitful marriage might calm his tendency to drink himself senseless in the city's brothels. But old resentments did not vanish. In the corridors, more than one timid servant heard the muffled raging of the king late at night. Margaery's soft voice would reply, though what she said none could discern through the heavy doors. And in the darkest corners of the capital, men loyal to the Lannisters conspired, passing messages to Casterly Rock. 1,000 shifting alliances knotted the tapestry of Westeros, and there were those who believed that the realm was a tinderbox, waiting only for the right spark to ignite open conflict. Tywin Lannister, bound by fury and humiliation, would not suffer such an insult in silence. He was not the sort of man to grovel or beg. He would move eventually, and when he did, it would be with all the power of the Westerlands behind him. Yet, for the moment, the realm continued forward, uncertain but hopeful. Margaery Tyrell, the new queen, made swift allies at court. She had a knack for saying the right word at the right time, for charming the great ladies of the realm with her graceful manners. She visited the orphans and distributed bread and roses among the small folk, winning them over in droves. Even Robert, in his scowling moments, seemed powerless against her quiet determination to ensure that King's Landing flourished. She kept up the appearances of wedded contentment, walking upon the king's arm in court ceremonies, listening attentively as he regaled visitors with tales of his youth, and laughing when he teased her in that booming voice. Behind the scenes, she conversed with her grandmother, the sharp-tongued Olenna Tyrell, who had taken up residence in the Red Keep to guide her granddaughter through the political storms. Olenna's arrival was hardly subtle. She left a wake of pointed remarks that unsettled half the court, but Margaery used her grandmother's advice sparingly and carefully, masking it beneath her own diplomatic veneer. Before long, news came from the north. Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, had received word of the king's new marriage and of the dissolution of ties with the Lannisters. Caused quite a stir in Winterfell. Ned, a man of honor, worried about the future of Robert's children. He had never cared for Cersei, but the notion of setting aside children who might be innocents in the game of power weighed heavily on him. Yet he also understood the suspicion that the children were not Robert's. If the rumors proved true, that they were the product of an incestuous union between Cersei and Jaime, then Ned knew why Robert would act so violently. Perhaps, then, he considered this was justice, harsh though it might be. Ned sent a letter of formal congratulations to Robert and to Margaery, along with a promise of continued support from the north, though he did so with a cautious pen. He had no desire for the realm to descend into another war, no matter how the pieces on the board were rearranged. In King's Landing, Robert was determined to shore up his alliances. He ordered Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen to remain under close watch. Rumor in the streets claimed that Robert meant to reveal the truth of their parentage, only he never took that final step, perhaps for fear of what it might unleash if the realm learned the rightful heirs to the throne, at least in name, were all bastards. Instead, he had them declared unfit to inherit, citing their mother's treachery. He set them aside, but did not harm them. Margaery took quiet pains to see that the children were given courtesy, even though they looked upon her with fear and wariness. Joffrey, in particular, seethed with anger, barely hiding his contempt for the new queen. Myrcella was more demure, giving Margaery uncertain smiles, while Tommen clung to his kittens, too young to understand the fullness of it all. In many ways, Margaery's gentle approach prevented the children from becoming pariahs in the castle. As for Cersei, her once proud face was seldom seen in daylight. She remained locked away, rumor claimed, pacing like a caged lioness. Some said she had tried to arrange her escape by night, only to be intercepted by Robert's loyal guards. Others claimed the king demanded her presence in the Red Keep, awaiting some final act of retribution or a trial that never came. The tension was thick whenever her name was uttered. Soon, an unexpected wind blew from the east. Word reached the King's Landing harbor that Peter Baelish had sent envoys to the Free Cities, seeking expansions of trade to offset the gold lost by cutting ties with the Lannisters. Baelish was cunning and quick to adapt, courting wealthy merchants across the narrow sea. Varys, meanwhile, listened to whispers in the dark, his little birds reporting that Tywin Lannister was quietly assembling a host in the Westerlands. Perhaps he would strike at King's Landing itself, or perhaps he would move against the Tyrells. Yet the realm did not see open war. Not yet. Tywin was patient. He remembered how to wait for the perfect moment. In the Red Keep, Margaery carefully cultivated a sense of normalcy. She organized feasts for the visiting lords and ladies of Dorne, forging a tenuous amity with the Martells. She played her harp under the moonlight in the Maiden Vault, ensuring that even the most jaded courtiers could not help but admire her gentleness. She walked the gardens with Sansa Stark, who had come south as a lady-in-waiting. In short, Margaery Tyrell spread her roots through the capital, weaving alliances that would, she hoped, protect her from the storms that inevitably lurked on the horizon. One evening, after a feast in the Queen's honor, Renly Baratheon pulled Margaery aside in a secluded alcove overlooking Blackwater Bay. He smiled his charming smile, though it was tinged with an edge of earnest concern. He praised her for how well she was doing at court, and then said gently, "My brother can be a difficult man. If ever you need an ally, do not hesitate to call upon me." She knew there was more behind his words than mere familial courtesy. The two had an understanding, unspoken yet undeniable, that Margaery's marriage to Robert was one of opportunity for House Tyrell and House Baratheon alike, and that she might well need an ally if Robert's temper turned vicious. Still, she thanked him, letting him know she valued his counsel. She saw in his eyes not only courtesy but a certain relief. If Robert remained distracted with a new marriage, perhaps he would not hamper Renly's own ambitions. Thus, the new alliance took shape, an unspoken vow that Margaery and Renly, each in their own way, would shape King's Landing to their will. Robert himself was not blind to these machinations, but he found himself unexpectedly taken by Margaery's quiet kindness. Though he continued to carouse in the city's taverns, the nights when he returned to the Red Keep reeking of ale and cheap perfume grew fewer, and when Margaery welcomed him home with a soft smile, a gentle hand, and a patient ear, he sometimes felt the distant ghost of the man he had once been, the man who had dreamed of a family with Lyanna Stark, the man whose heart had been broken and hardened by war and betrayal. Of course, there were still outbursts. His anger could surface over the most trifling slights. A meal served cold, a minor lord who spoke out of turn. He slapped Margaery once in a fit of drunken rage, and she fled their chamber with a red mark blooming on her cheek. But come morning, when the ale had worn off, Robert summoned her again, and in a hoarse whisper that sounded suspiciously like an apology, he told her he would never again raise a hand against her. For her part, Margaery resolved that she would endure what she must. Queens were not made by a carefree life. They were forged in the crucible of power struggles, sharpened by necessity. If she could maintain the king's favor, she could steer him, at least in some measure. It was under this precarious equilibrium that the realm settled into a fragile lull. The Tyrell bannermen were largely pleased. The influence of Highgarden soared. Favors were granted to lords in the Reach, titles, positions, and trade rights, stoking the pride of one of the most fertile regions in the Seven Kingdoms. The Stormlands found in Margaery a queen who did not neglect them either. She oversaw distributions of seeds and livestock to help the less prosperous areas battered by storms. Meanwhile, the Vale, under Lysa Arryn, gave cautious blessings to the new union, though Lysa's mind was flighty and her loyalty wavered. The Iron Islands remained aloof, as they always did, uninterested in the doings of the Greenlanders. Yet, quietly, the North extended a guarded acceptance. House Stark was loyal to the crown, but Ned Stark worried about the possibility of a renewed war. He wrote to Margaery directly, the tone in his letter fatherly, advising caution and praising her kindness in dealing with Robert's children. Margaery responded politely, acknowledging his concerns, emphasizing she wished only for the prosperity of the realm. But the Lannisters had not surrendered. Tywin Lannister had not forgiven. For months, the Westerlands seethed in silence. The golden mines under Casterly Rock continued to churn out wealth. Jaime Lannister fumed in private, exiled from the Kingsguard, forced to roam like a disgraced knight. He had returned to his father's side, along with many of the Lannister bannermen who had once occupied important positions at court. Yet King's Landing did not burn, at least not yet. Tywin was no fool. He would not march against the combined might of the Baratheons and Tyrells without cause. He bided his time, seeking an advantage. He wrote letters to powerful lords, reminding them of old debts and obligations, tempting them with gold. He pressed his agents to watch for any sign of weakness or scandal in the capital. And as the months passed, he plotted, waiting for a misstep from Robert or Margaery, some crack in the foundation that he could exploit. A subtle shift occurred when a rumor began to swirl that Margaery might be with child. The notion thrilled many in the small council. A new Baratheon heir, one backed by the Tyrells, would cement the new alliance for a generation. Yet Robert's prior children complicated matters. Were they truly not his? If they were bastards, how would the realm react to the idea that the king had locked away their mother and cast them aside? Would a new child be accepted as the rightful heir without question? The rumor of Margaery's pregnancy was whispered in the kitchens, repeated by stable hands, speculated upon by lords and ladies alike, though the queen made no official announcement. She carried herself with the same grace as ever, though those observant few saw a new glow on her cheeks, a slight protective gesture of her hand over her stomach. The possibility alone sent ripples through court. It emboldened some who pinned their hopes on a stable succession. It frightened others who saw it as the final severing of ties with House Lannister. Once a new heir was born, Cersei's children would be overshadowed, forever cut off. On one occasion, Varys commented to Littlefinger in the halls, "A new flower in bloom often casts the old seeds into shadow," to which Littlefinger simply smiled, an unreadable gleam in his eye. The tension reached a boiling point the evening Tywin Lannister arrived in King's Landing. He came at the head of a small retinue, only a few hundred Lannister guards and bannermen. It was not a war host, but the message was clear. He had come to confront the king in his own seat of power, unafraid. The gold lion banners draped from the lances of his knights, a silent testament that House Lannister was far from cowed. Robert greeted Tywin in the throne room. Margaery stood at Robert's side, her face a serene mask. The court gathered, hushed, for all understood that this meeting could well ignite the spark that led to war, or might lead to a brittle peace. Tywin approached with measured steps, every bit the stoic lion. His icy gaze flicked across the courtiers, the new queen, and finally settled on Robert. Without preamble, Tywin began to speak. He demanded to know the charges by which Robert had annulled his marriage to Cersei, demanded an explanation for the disgrace, demanded the return of Lannister funds that had contributed to the crown's coffers. Robert's face reddened. He snapped in retort, calling Tywin's daughter a liar and an adulteress, though he carefully avoided naming Jaime as the other party. Margaery did not stir, but she watched closely, her heart pounding, aware that a single misplaced word could lead to bloodshed. Tywin, for his part, listened, his jaw clenched. Then, quietly, he replied that the debt the crown owed House Lannister was substantial, that if Robert refused to settle it, the Westerlands would no longer finance the crown. The king, incensed, retorted that House Tyrell was more than capable of ensuring the crown's wealth. Tywin's lip curled in disdain. The entire throne room fell silent, as if everyone were holding their breath. Then, Robert declared that Tywin was to stand down or face the consequences. Tywin, in response, demanded the king release Cersei and restore her dignity. No mention of making her queen again, merely a command that she be freed. Before the tension could crescendo into violence, Margaery gently placed a hand on Robert's arm. The king blinked, looked at her, and in that brief moment, she murmured something that only he could hear, the faintest whisper. Robert's anger, if not doused, was momentarily contained. He growled that he would consider the matter of Cersei. Tywin held his ground. For a moment, the two men stared one another down. The king who had taken the throne by force of rebellion and the lord who had underwritten that rebellion's success. The watchers could hardly believe the depths of the animosity that had replaced what was once a political partnership. In the days that followed, Tywin Lannister remained in the capital, prowling through the Red Keep like a caged beast. He demanded to see Cersei. At first, Robert refused, but Margaery persuaded the king to allow a brief meeting, noting that denying Tywin might provoke him further. The meeting happened under heavy guard in the dim corridors. When Tywin emerged, his face was stony, and no one knew precisely what was said between father and daughter. But from that moment, Tywin's manner turned glacial. He penned letters by the dozen, sending ravens out each morning. Whispers said he was rallying bannermen from the Reach itself, men who might be sympathetic to the Lannisters over the Tyrells, or that he was forging alliances with houses disgruntled by Robert's new policies. Margaery strove to gather what she could from her courtiers. Olenna Tyrell likewise pulled strings, subverting or negating Tywin's attempts wherever possible. The realm teetered on the brink. Meanwhile, Robert grew more volatile, aware that his position was precarious. He was king, yes, but the throne seemed less stable than ever. One night, Margaery found him in the solar, staring into a half-filled goblet of wine, the candles guttering in the silence. His broad shoulders seemed to stoop, as if the weight of the crown pressed down upon him more than ever before. When she entered, he didn't bellow a greeting or grin his usual half-drunken grin. Instead, he looked up with a hollow gaze, as if glimpsing the ghost of his former self in the flicker of the candlelight. Margaery approached, her footsteps quiet against the stones. She saw in his eyes a question he could not quite voice, perhaps regret for a life of war and bloodshed, or for the marriage that had never been. She set a gentle hand on his. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, Robert whispered, "I wanted to be a good king once. I wanted to be the man that Lyanna would have been proud of." Margaery's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in his words. She said nothing, merely let him speak. "But I grew bitter. Married the wrong woman, wasted years in the bottom of a wine cup, and all I've done is stir up a viper's nest. Now I've got Tywin breathing down my neck, and the realm ready to tear itself apart, and none of it will bring Lyanna back." He took a shaky breath. "I'm no fool. I know you married me to strengthen your house, but you've been kinder to me in a few months than Cersei ever was. If only I had, if only." His voice faltered, and in that moment, Margaery glimpsed the broken man behind the crown. She knelt beside him, her voice soft as she assured him that, no matter what had passed, the future might yet be shaped into something better. She told him that if he truly wanted to be a strong king, he could start now, by protecting the realm from the chaos that threatened to engulf it. Encouraged by her words, Robert convened the small council the following day, determined to find a peaceful resolution with Tywin, or at least by time. Renly, ever the diplomat, suggested a royal progress to the Westerlands, an opportunity for the king to show goodwill. Mace Tyrell balked at the idea, but Margaery supported it, believing that a personal visit might ease tensions before Tywin fully committed to rebellion. Though Robert hated traveling, especially to a land controlled by the Lannisters, he realized there was merit in showing strength without resorting to immediate violence. So, the king set out with a retinue of knights, guards, and advisors, Margaery by his side. The progress was slow and fraught with unease. At every turn, they found peasants who either bowed in awe at the king's presence or trembled in fear, uncertain whether war would break out on their doorsteps. Word of the king's approach reached Tywin long before they arrived at the borders of the Westerlands. And while Tywin did not greet them warmly, he did not outright refuse them entry. They arrived at the gates of a minor Lannister bannerman's keep to find the banners of the Gold Lion still flying, but the gates thrown wide in begrudging hospitality. The tension was palpable. Feasts were held, though they were meager by Lannister standards, perhaps an intentional slight. Margaery, wearing a traveling cloak of Baratheon gold clasped with a rose brooch, did her best to charm the local lords, reminding them that House Tyrell was not their enemy, that the realm was one, that they would continue to benefit from trade and peace. Robert took to drinking heavily each night, though he managed to keep his anger in check. The subtle dance of diplomacy stretched on for days. Finally, a summons came. Tywin would receive them in a fortress near the coast, under a flag of truce. The small entourage traveled once more, the king's sworn shields vigilant. Margaery felt a chill in her bones as they approached. She knew Tywin was a formidable foe. If he desired, this meeting could be their last. Yet she believed if war erupted, it would be far worse for both sides. She clung to the hope that Tywin would not risk the utter ruin that an open rebellion might bring. They met in a torchlit hall. Robert sat at the head of a long table, Margaery at his right, Renly at his left, and a handful of advisors behind them. Opposite them sat Tywin Lannister, his face as unreadable as ever, flanked by Kevan Lannister and a handful of bannermen who eyed Robert with suspicion. No weapons were drawn, but the tension was as sharp as a drawn blade. The king began by outlining the terms he was willing to offer. He would release Cersei from house arrest, granting her safe passage to Casterly Rock, on the condition that she leave court permanently. The crown would also repay a portion of the debt owed to the Lannisters over 5 years, with interest, and in return, Tywin would swear not to raise arms against the throne, nor seek to conspire with other lords to overthrow the king's authority. Robert stated all this with surprising clarity, though his voice occasionally trembled with suppressed anger. Tywin listened in silence. Then, slowly, he inclined his head, though it was not a gesture of subservience. "I see," he said, "that your grace has given thought to these matters." He paused, letting his icy gaze flick across the Baratheons. "There is one matter, however, that remains unaddressed." Robert's knuckles turned white as he clenched the arms of his chair. Tywin continued, "My daughter's children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, they are of Lannister blood, no matter what claims might be made as to their father. I would have your assurances that they will be provided for, educated, and not cast aside to die in obscurity. They are my blood, and I will see them cared for." He spoke the words with the tone of a man demanding property be maintained, yet there was a glint in his cold green eyes that bespoke genuine paternal fury. Margaery felt Robert tense beside her. She placed a gentle hand upon his forearm and spoke quietly, but firmly. She assured Lord Tywin that the children would be given every courtesy. They would be housed in the Red Keep or in a royal estate, if that was Tywin's wish, with tutors and attendants to see to their needs, provided they did not become pawns in any rebellion. A long silence followed. At last, Tywin said, "Then let us put this in writing," and so they did. The two sides hammered out the details into the night, with Renly and Kevan Lannister drafting the terms. Margaery sat quietly through it, interjecting only when necessary, observing the dance of power between the king and the lord of the Westerlands. By dawn, an uneasy pact had been struck. Tywin would depart for Casterly Rock, taking Cersei and the children if he wished. A fraction of the Lannister gold would continue to flow to the crown in exchange for certain trade privileges. The question of inheritance for Robert's children by Cersei would remain publicly ambiguous. Neither fully disowned nor officially recognized, while Margaery's potential children would be first in line for the throne. It was a compromise that left neither side truly satisfied, but it did avert immediate war. Tywin, having signed the documents, rose from the table. With a final, penetrating look at Robert, he said, "Do not think this is ended. Our agreements are but words, and the world is built on blood and gold." Then he departed, his cloak swirling behind him, leaving the king and his new queen to nurse a fragile peace. In the weeks that followed, Robert returned to King's Landing, physically exhausted and emotionally raw. Margaery tended to him, ensuring he was fed and that he found some respite from the endless negotiations. The city greeted them with curiosity. Had the threat of war passed? Whispers circulated that Tywin had returned to the Rock with Cersei and the children, fulfilling part of the agreement. Indeed, Cersei left the capital in a silent procession, accompanied by 100 Lannister men-at-arms. The small folk either jeered or stood indifferent as the once queen departed. Joffrey rode beside her, his face a storm of rage, while Myrcella wept softly, and Tommen clutched his kitten. They vanished through the city gates and were gone. For a time, it seemed that Robert's new marriage might bear the fruit of genuine peace. Trade improved, as did the distribution of reach-harvested grain. King's Landing found itself less prone to the riots and shortages that had so often plagued it. Margaery continued her charitable works, and her popularity soared. The faith of the small folk in their new queen grew, even if the lords of the realm eyed her with a mixture of respect and caution. A letter arrived from Ned Stark, expressing guarded optimism about the stability of the realm. The Riverlands, under the Tullis, expressed relief. The Vale likewise seemed content to remain quiet. The North focused on its own affairs. Even the Iron Islands did not stir. For the moment, Westeros breathed easier. Yet the Lannisters were not the only threat in the Seven Kingdoms. Far to the south, Dorne remembered old wounds. The death of Elia Martell and her children during the rebellion remained a raw scar upon House Martell's honor. With the diminishing power of the Lannisters, Prince Doran Martell saw an opportunity. He began to conduct discreet negotiations. He reached out to potential allies, testing whether the new queen or the king's younger brother, Renly, might be swayed to make concessions that favored Dorne. At the same time, the Dornish sea captains reported sightings of Targaryen loyalists across the Narrow Sea. Whispers that Viserys Targaryen and his sister Daenerys still lived, seeking support in the free cities. King Robert, once so determined to see the Targaryens extinct, seemed to have let that mission lapse in his recent struggles. No one could say what might come of that. Margaery listened to these rumors with caution. She knew that if a Targaryen claimant returned, the realm might be plunged into a civil war that could make the Baratheon-Lannister feud look tame. Even so, she was only one woman. She could not control all the pieces on the board. She could only advise her king and strive to keep the realm stable enough that the small folk would not suffer. One day, as she walked in the gardens of the Red Keep, Margaery paused beneath a blooming lemon tree. She closed her eyes, letting the mild sunlight caress her face. Inhaling the sweet scent, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps the realm was on a path to healing. Then she heard footsteps approaching. It was Littlefinger wearing his confident smirk. He bowed smoothly, complimented her grace, and offered his services should she wish to handle any matter discreetly. His presence reminded her that courtly politics remained a nest of vipers. She smiled politely, but inside she knew that men like Littlefinger and Varys never ceased their intrigues. They would serve her interests only so long as it served their own. She told him she appreciated his loyalty, but she needed nothing at the moment. He bowed again, his eyes glittering with amusement, and departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night, Robert joined her in their bedchamber. The king was more sober than usual, and though the lines of worry on his brow had not faded, he seemed calmer. He asked her how she found her life in King's Landing, if she regretted marrying a man so much older. She replied with careful honesty, telling him she had found purpose here, that she believed she could help bring prosperity to the capital and beyond. She said that if Robert truly wished to be a just king, she would stand beside him. He kissed her then with surprising gentleness. Though the stench of wine still clung to him, and though she had never truly loved him in the way a young woman might yearn for a romantic partner, in that moment, she felt a cautious affection. Here was a broken man trying, in his flawed way, to repair something of himself. She let herself believe, just for that night, that things might improve. As the months turned into a year, Margaery's belly began to swell, confirming the rumors of her pregnancy. The city rejoiced at the promise of a new Baratheon heir. Minstrels composed ballads about the blossoming rose who had tamed the storm. The small folk placed garlands at the steps of the Great September, praying for the health of the queen and her child. Even Robert seemed invigorated by the news, vowing to lead the realm into an era of prosperity for his son or daughter. Yet with every step forward, there were shadows. Tywin Lannister sent cold letters from the Rock, acknowledging the pregnancy but making no vow of fealty beyond the letter of his agreement. Cersei, ensconced in her father's fortress, spewed vitriol in her own letters, calling Margaery a whore, denouncing Robert's child as a usurper. The words stung Margaery less than they might have stung another woman. She had expected nothing different from Cersei. The important thing was that Cersei remained far from King's Landing, lacking the power to do more than curse. Yet, Margaery could not rid herself of a sense of foreboding. The Lannisters were proud and patient. They would wait, as a lion waits in the brush, until the opportunity for a killing blow arose. Still, each day brought new tasks. Margaery visited the Sept to pray for her child's safe birth. She received emissaries from the Reach, her father's men, who brought gifts and tidings. Olenna Tyrell hovered near, offering counsel with her usual peppery remarks. The city bustled with commerce, thanks to the Tyrell willingness to ship food and goods up the Mander and across the roads to King's Landing. The people ate better than they had in years. The gold cloaks, now under the command of a man chosen by Renly, patrolled more diligently, reducing crime in the alleys. On the surface, the realm seemed to be in an odd state of calm. A precarious peace, yes, but better than open war. Yet Margaery knew how fragile it all was. One spark, one betrayal, and the Seven Kingdoms could erupt once more. She could do no more than tend to the king, watch the political undercurrents, and pray that the child within her womb might be born into a realm that was not drenched in blood. When the time finally came for her to give birth, the entire court waited on edge. Robert paced outside the Queen's chambers, half mad with worry. The labor was long, lasting from midday until the black hours of the night, Margaery's screams echoing through the corridors. Maesters hovered, applying poultices, offering tinctures to dull the pain. Olenna Tyrell barked commands at the maids, ensuring that no incompetent hands hindered her granddaughter. Renly prayed in the Sept, flanked by some of the more devout courtiers, while Peter Baelish watched with a calculating expression. Even Varys, in his fluttering silk robes, seemed nervous. But as dawn broke, Aerys' cries subsided, and the mewling sound of a newborn drifted through the heavy doors. The maester emerged, face gleaming with sweat, to declare that the Queen had delivered a healthy daughter. Robert, letting out a roar of half joy and half relief, barreled into the chamber to see the child. He took the squirming infant in his large arms, tears shining in his eyes. A daughter, yes, but that did not dampen his pride in the slightest. He knelt by Margaery's bedside, pressing a kiss to her forehead, promising her the world for this gift she had given him. The child's tuft of hair was dark, and Robert grinned widely, proclaiming this child as truly his. News spread quickly through the Red Keep and beyond. A princess was born, a true Baratheon princess, with Tyrell blood strengthening her claim. The birth of the princess changed the game once more. Celebrations erupted in the city. Lords and ladies from across Westeros sent gifts. Even the Lannisters, though grudgingly, dispatched a crate of gold-laden baby trinkets. No doubt from Tywin's stores, though no letter accompanied the gift. Mace Tyrell preened, reveling in his new role as grandsire to the heir to the throne. Olenna sent out witty letters describing the child as a blooming little rose storm. Robert, swept up in paternal pride, announced tournaments to celebrate, promised lavish feasts, and even took steps to ensure that King's Landing's defenses were improved, for he swore none would harm his wife or child. Margaery, exhausted yet joyful, took to her new role with the same sense of duty she had shown in all things. She named the child Baratheon, of course, but paid homage to her own house by giving her a middle name reminiscent of Tyrell tradition. And if she sometimes looked down at the child's sleeping face with a mix of love and apprehension, she kept such worries to herself. She knew that in the great Game of Thrones, innocence was rarely afforded to children of the crown. Peace, however, was never guaranteed. With the birth of the Baratheon Tyrell princess, the realm's power alignment shifted once again. Houses that had sat on the fence now leaned toward supporting the crown, enticed by the stability Margaery's union seemed to offer. But the Westerlands remained a force to be reckoned with. Though Tywin had not risen in open rebellion, his cunning mind would be at work. He might attempt to use Joffrey, Myrcella, or Tommen as pawns in some future claim, or he might bide his time until the realm's focus turned elsewhere, perhaps to the Targaryen exiles across the sea. For now, the King's Landing court reveled in the birth of the princess, the city draped in black and gold banners intertwined with golden roses, celebrating well into the night for weeks on end. Margaery found herself inundated with visits from ladies wishing to see the baby, from minstrels composing lullabies, from septas offering blessings. She accepted it all with a gentle smile, though the exhaustion weighed on her. Robert, to his credit, spent more time in the castle now, less time in brothels and taverns. He seemed determined to be a present father, perhaps redeeming himself for the mistakes he had made with his other children. Still, Margaery knew better than to trust that his old habits would never resurface. She hoped, at least, that fatherhood would give him new reasons to temper his worst impulses. As the child grew week by week, Margaery's role as queen solidified. The court learned to respect her, if not fear her quiet influence. She continued to advocate for policies that brought food to the small folk, that improved trade routes, that stabilized the realm. Old lords who had grown complacent under the Lannister regime found themselves unable to dismiss her counsel, for Robert now listened to her. When a dispute arose between a minor house in the Reach and another in the Crownlands, Margaery helped mediate, using all the diplomatic skill she had honed under her grandmother's tutelage. The result was a settlement that strengthened the city's provisions. She did all of this with the child in her arms or under the watchful gaze of trusted wet nurses. Some men grumbled that a queen should not meddle in governance, but others praised her, seeing in her a reasoned voice that could keep the king's temper in check. Even Renly seemed relieved, for it meant less burden fell on him as hand, allowing him to do what he did best: charm lords and ladies, build alliances, and host magnificent feasts. When the princess was 3 months old, Margaery took her to the Great September of Baelor to receive a formal blessing. It was a grand occasion. Bells rang out across the city, and the people gathered to catch a glimpse of their new princess. The High Septon anointed the child with holy oils, praying that she would grow in wisdom and grace. Robert stood behind Margaery, a protective hand on her shoulder. He grinned and waved at the adoring crowd. The moment felt almost surreal to those who remembered the tension and near war that had plagued the city but a year before. Was it possible that the realm had indeed found a measure of harmony under this new arrangement? Skeptics quietly insisted that it would not last, that eventually the Lannisters would strike, or the Targaryens would return, or some new crisis would erupt. Yet on that day, in the sunlight streaming through the sept's stained glass, Margaery believed in the possibility that her child might inherit a Westeros at peace. Still, she did not grow complacent. She instructed the maester to keep her informed of letters arriving from the Westerlands. She pressed her grandmother, Olenna, to maintain their network of informants, ensuring that if Tywin so much as sharpened a sword in the direction of King's Landing, they would know. Littlefinger and Varys offered their services, each with ulterior motives, but Margaery was willing to trade small favors for information that could protect her child's future. She remembered the warning Tywin had issued to Robert. The world is built on blood and gold. If she was to protect her new family, she would need to be both generous and formidable. Step by step, she arranged the pieces, forging alliances with minor houses, extending courtesy to visiting envoys from Dorne and beyond. She even courted the friendship of families once loyal to the Targaryens, ensuring that if whispers of Daenerys or Viserys reached them, they might at least give King's Landing a chance to respond diplomatically rather than with immediate bloodshed. As the princess approached her first name day, the realm was invited to a celebration in King's Landing. The streets bustled with travelers from all over Westeros. Merchants hawked exotic wares, acrobats performed for coins, and minstrels filled the air with tunes extolling the virtues of the newborn princess. Robert ordered a great tournament to be held in the princess's honor. Knights flocked to the capital to test their mettle. Renly oversaw the arrangements, ensuring the stands would hold thousands of spectators. Margaery ensured that a portion of the profits from the tourney fees would be distributed to the city's orphans, a gesture that further endeared her to the common folk. Nobles from every corner of the realm arrived, many bearing gifts for the princess, hoping to curry favor with the king and queen. A delicate hush fell when the Lannister envoy arrived. It was not Tywin himself, but a cousin bearing a gilded cradle lined with crimson velvet. He presented it to the royal family in the name of House Lannister. Robert's smile was strained as he accepted it, but Margaery thanked the envoy graciously, though she might never lay her child down in a Lannister cradle. Peace was a dance, and courtesy was the music that kept everyone's blades sheathed. On the day of the tourney, the crowds thronged the stands. The king and queen sat in a high box, the princess nestled in a decorated cradle behind them, attended by maids and guarded by gold cloaks. Robert wore a cloak of black velvet with gold satin lining, the Baratheon stag stitched across his back, and Margaery wore a gown of pale green and gold roses, symbolizing both of their houses entwined. Knights jousted in the lists, lances splintering to the roar of the crowd. Renly participated, unhorsing several challengers before he was bested by Tyrell, Margaery's brother, who dedicated his victory to the queen and her child. Robert, in a moment of good humor, roared with laughter at the sight of his brother toppled into the dirt, then clapped Loras on the back when he came to present himself. The festivities carried on late into the day, with archery contests, melee brawls, and feasts bursting with roast boar, capons, and lemon cakes. Wine flowed freely, and though Robert partook, Margaery saw that his joy was genuine. He was no longer the same sullen man consumed by regrets. He had found a new measure of life, with a daughter to protect and a wife who supported him. But in the swirl of celebration, Margaery's instincts told her that danger lurked. For every cheer, for every toast, she noticed the occasional stony glare of a lord displeased by House Tyrell's rise, or the hungry calculating gaze of a Sellsword who saw opportunity in chaos. She observed Littlefinger whispering in the ear of a Braavosi banker, Varys gliding through the crowd like a shadow in silk. She noticed the Lannister cousin departing early, perhaps to dispatch a raven to Casterly Rock. And she understood that, for all the pageantry, the game continued. Power had shifted but not settled. Still, as her eyes drifted to her daughter, who cooed softly in the cradle, Margaery resolved to hold fast to the hope that the future would be brighter than the past. If she could steer Robert away from his darker impulses, if she could maintain alliances with the great houses, if she could keep the realm united long enough for her daughter to ascend the throne unchallenged, perhaps the Seven Kingdoms might know an age of peace. That night, the final feast raged in the torchlit halls of the Red Keep, guests dancing and feasting to the sounds of flutes and drums. The princess slept in a quiet chamber, guarded by trusted men. Margaery swayed in a dance with Robert, who despite his bulk moved with surprising grace. He gazed at her with an odd mixture of gratitude and something resembling love. She smiled back, her heart buoyed by the moment, even as her mind raced with the knowledge that everything could change at any instant. When the music ended, Robert lifted her hand and kissed it. The crowd cheered, raising goblets in salute. And in that flash of candlelight, as Margaery looked around, she saw so many eyes upon them, loyal eyes, envious eyes, cunning eyes. Yes, she thought this was how the game was played. One day, she might recount to her daughter the story of how she became queen, how she tamed the storm that was King Robert, and how she fought to save the realm from devouring itself. But for now, she would live in the present triumph, content that a fragile peace had been won, at least for a time. The days turned to weeks and the weeks to months. The child grew stronger, crawling across the floor of Margaery's solar, chasing after bright ribbons dangled by handmaidens. Robert continued to attempt a more conscientious rule, leaning on Renly's advice, sometimes heeding Margaery's gentle suggestions. The Riverlands saw fewer bandits. The roads were patrolled. The small council set about balancing the crown's debts. Even the Iron Bank of Bravos was approached for negotiations, ensuring that the realm would not be crippled by default. In subtle ways, Margaery's influence shaped decisions, from how the crown's gold was spent to which lords received royal favor. She knew she walked a delicate path. Robert might bristle if she appeared too controlling, but he had come to trust her counsel more than anyone's. Over time, the king's rages grew less frequent, his nights of carousing rarer. He was still Robert, a man prone to indulgence, too easily swayed by flattery, haunted by the memory of Lyanna Stark, but a man improved by the presence of a wife he did not wholly despise. The threat from the Westerlands remained a constant specter. Tywin Lannister's letters were terse but correct. He did not violate the truce. He did not openly provoke the throne. Yet, Margaery heard from her grandmother that the Lannister forges were busy, swords and armor being crafted in alarming quantities. Spies in the free cities reported that Lannister gold was buying sellswords and building alliances. Perhaps Tywin prepared for a day that might never come, or perhaps he waited only for a sign of weakness from Robert. Margaery prayed that sign would not appear. While the realm was not wholly at peace, unrest simmered in the Iron Islands. Rumors of Targaryen heirs lingered across the sea. King's Landing itself enjoyed a rare season of relative calm. Margaery embraced it, using the time to cultivate loyalty, sponsor improvements to the city's water supply, and ensure that the small folk began to see in her the very symbol of compassion and stability. If, in the future, war did come, she wanted the realm to remember that the Queen had tried to spare them from suffering. In the privacy of their chambers, Robert sometimes spoke of his regrets about the rebellion, about how he never truly let go of Lyanna, how his hatred for the Targaryens had fueled so many rash decisions. She listened without judgment, offering comfort where she could. And though she never said it aloud, part of her understood that this closeness was born of a strange compromise. He had lost his first love, and she had married a man she did not choose for romance. They had come together in the name of power, each seeking a better outcome for their families. Yet, in that unromantic arrangement, they had forged a partnership that might endure. More than once, she watched him cradle their daughter, his thick fingers delicately stroking her hair, and thought, perhaps this was enough. Perhaps a child's future happiness could be the mortar that bound their union, if not love in the grand sense, then at least a shared sense of protectiveness. Seasons shifted, the days grew shorter, and a chill crept into the nights. Margaery received word that her father, Mace, wanted them to visit Highgarden for a grand festival. Robert initially scoffed. He loathed travel, especially a long journey, but Renly convinced him it would be wise to maintain strong relations with the Tyrell bannermen. Plans were made, preparations set in motion. Yet before they could depart, a raven arrived from the Eyrie, bearing grim news from Lisa Arryn. Rumors of a strange illness spreading in certain mountain villages, men speaking of shadows in the night. It might have been a minor matter, but then news came from the wall that wildlings were stirring, fleeing deeper into the south. Whispers circulated of White Walkers, of dead men walking. Tales that the small folk dismissed as fables, but which the Night's Watch took seriously. The realm's stability, so carefully nurtured, faced 1,000 potential threats from every corner. Margaery realized that peace was always temporary. Her child, still too young to walk, already had a precarious inheritance. As the flickering candlelight illuminated the pages of letters reporting these threats, Margaery turned to find Robert standing beside her. He set a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Trouble, my queen?" She nodded, explaining what she had read. He sighed. "The world's never short of trouble," but there was a note of resolve in his voice. "We'll see to it. We'll see to it all." And in that moment, Margaery felt a spark of genuine faith that perhaps, through the cracks in Robert's armor, something of the heroic spirit of his youth remained, tempered now by experience, guided in part by her presence. She rose from her seat, folding the letters. Together, they walked down the corridors of the Red Keep, the guards bowing as they passed, the tapestries swaying in the night's breeze. They reached the chamber where their daughter slept, the soft glow of a single lamp revealing the peaceful slumber of the princess. Robert stepped closer, gazing at the child with an expression of both wonder and fierce protectiveness. Margaery rested her hand in his, and they stood side by side, father and mother, king and queen, watchers at the cradle of the realm's uncertain future. Beyond these walls, storms brewed. Political storms, the hidden wrath of the Lannisters, the rumored specter of dragons across the sea, the tales of darkness rising in the far north. But here, in this room, all was quiet. One child's steady breathing was a promise of possibility. Neither Robert nor Margaery could know what trials would come in the months and years ahead. They could not know whether House Lannister would rise again in open defiance, or whether the Targaryen exiles might land on Westerosi shores to stake a claim upon the Iron Throne, or whether the rumors from the Wall were more than stories. But in that moment, King Robert and Queen Margaery's marriage had reshaped the game, casting down Lannister dominance before it could fully take root, and forging a new path for the Baratheon line. Whether that path would lead to more bloodshed or a lasting era of peace remained to be seen. Margaery whispered a silent prayer to the Seven that, with faith and cunning, they might guide the realm toward the gentler season it so desperately deserved. And as she watched the rise and fall of her daughter's tiny chest, she allowed herself a faint, hopeful smile. After all, sometimes the seeds of a better tomorrow were planted in the most unlikely of circumstances. And in the flicker of lamplight, she saw the hope of a kingdom that might one day thrive under a queen who had once been a Tyrell rose, and a king who had chosen at last to cast aside old grudges and broken promises, taking a leap of faith towards something new. Robert Baratheon stood beside the cradle, his thick arms folded over the broad expanse of his chest. He scarcely seemed to breathe. Lamplight cast flickering patterns across the mosaic floor of the royal nursery, illuminating the soft roundness of the infant's cheeks. She was still too small to fill the cradle, her hands tiny fists that curled and uncurled against the air, but she commanded her father's attention as though she were born to it. Margaery Tyrell Baratheon, Queen Margaery, observed the king in silence for a time. She wore a simple robe of pale green, her hair in a loose braid that tumbled over one shoulder. Although she was fatigued and still recovering from labor, she mustered a tranquil smile. The hush enveloping the cradle felt almost sacred. It was a moment she doubted Robert would ever have believed possible only a year before. The warrior king, once half lost to drink and regret, standing so reverently before his child. "She's strong," Robert said, almost to himself, his gruff voice surprisingly soft. "Look at her, a born Baratheon." He reached a hand toward the child, as if afraid she might break at the slightest touch. Yet she did not startle. Instead, the baby gurgled, scrunching her face in a way that made Robert chuckle. "I, a Baratheon, no doubt." Margaery leaned against him, slipping her slender arm around his waist. There was still a faint ache in her body from giving birth, but the closeness brought her comfort. She thought of how different her life might have been had fate twisted in another direction. If House Tyrell had not seized the opportunity to petition a marriage, if Robert had not been spurred by fury, or by that flicker of longing for something better than he had known with Cersei. So many choices and happenstances had led them to this nursery. She felt the king's warmth, the solidity of him, and she allowed her eyes to drift shut for a moment. "She'll have a better world," Margaery said gently, "if we can keep the realm at peace." Robert's expression hardened a fraction. Though fatherhood had softened him, no one who knew Robert Baratheon would call him gentle. His large hand rested protectively upon Margaery's shoulder. "A better world, yes. I'll make sure of it." The vow was half promise, half warning. No one will harm her. Not Tywin Lannister, not the Targaryens, not any man across the narrow sea who thinks to set foot here. If they try, they'll taste my hammer. Margaery looked into his eyes, aware of how easily his bravado could become a conflagration of temper. "Then we shall ensure they have no reason to threaten us." Her tone was soft, but behind it lay a quiet steel. She had learned enough by now. Subtlety often swayed Robert more effectively than direct confrontation. "There is strength in unity, my lord. We're leave scars we've yet to fully heal. A stable realm can be a formidable shield." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a grunt, he relented. "You always talk sense. I suppose that's why I need you," he muttered. His gaze returned to the child, an almost sheepish fondness in his eyes. He bent his head to plant a tender, awkward kiss atop the baby's brow. Then, as if embarrassed by his own display of affection, he turned abruptly and strode to the doorway. "I'll have the men check the gates again tonight," he said over his shoulder. "We've had more travelers come to see the babe than I'd expected. I don't trust half the flattery that's been heaped upon us this past moon." His lip curled. "The city's quiet now, but quiet can be a ruse." Margaery dipped her head. "Of course, my king." Once he had gone, she looked again at her daughter, who had drifted into that half-sleeping, half-waking state infants often occupy. A hush settled in the nursery. In that hush, Margaery gathered her courage. She knew Robert's vow of protection was genuine, but the future was not so easily tamed. The daughter of Highgarden was no fool. She recognized the precarious web that bound the Seven Kingdoms. Tywin Lannister sat in Casterly Rock, seething like a coiled lion, awaiting the chance to strike. The North was loyal for now, but Ned Stark might yet have cause to question the king's decisions, particularly if events threatened the fragile equilibrium. Dorne nursed ancient wounds, while the Targaryen heirs across the sea loomed as a distant but persistent rumor, a specter from Robert's greatest fear. And all the while, the rumor of unearthly forces stirring beyond the wall gave her an unsettling chill, though many dismissed them as old wives' tales. If there was even a scrap of truth, it could redefine the realm's priorities. Yes, 1,000 dangers lay in wait, and Margaery did not deceive herself into thinking a mere year of relative peace guaranteed the next decade or more. Yet for this night, at least, she allowed herself a moment of calm. She rested her hand upon the edge of the cradle and listened to her daughter's soft breathing, silently praying to the Seven for guidance, for the wisdom to steer Robert, and for the strength to shield the innocent life before her. When dawn broke, she would resume her queenly duties with fresh resolve. The next morning, Margaery rose early. The mid-autumn sun cast a pale glow over the Red Keep's towers. The windows in her bedchamber had been thrown open to air out the lingering sense of night, letting in the crisp breeze from Blackwater Bay. She dressed in a gown of gold-trimmed green, a subtle statement of House Tyrell's presence interwoven with Baratheon black and gold. As a maid carefully arranged her hair, pinning it back from her face, she studied the reflection in her mirror. Eyes bright but with the faintest shadow beneath them from lack of sleep, a face still youthful yet bearing the weight of monarchy. The child was not yet 4 moons old, and Margaery felt the added strain of motherhood and queenship with each passing day. In the next room, Olenna Tyrell, her indomitable grandmother, awaited her. Although the older woman had a private suite, she often lingered in Margaery's outer solar each morning, perched upon a cushioned chair with a cup of hot spiced wine. Margaery greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. Olenna wrinkled her nose and gently patted Margaery's arm, a gesture of affectionate exasperation. "Still not enough rest, child. I can see it in your eyes," Olenna observed. "The day hasn't even begun, and you look as though you've already sat through a war council." Margaery's lips curved into a small smile. "I've just become accustomed to fewer hours. The babe requires attention, and the king can be restless when certain anxieties plague him." She chose her words carefully. Even in private, she was mindful of how her confidences might travel. But with Olenna, she permitted herself more openness than with anyone else. "He read a missive last night that put him in a foul mood. Something about the veil, I believe." Olenna eyed her. "The veil? Chim. Lisa Arryn has always been a timid creature with more fear than sense. And that milksop boy of hers, God's help him. If it's trouble, I doubt she knows how to handle it. But no matter." The Dowager Lady of Highgarden set down her wine. "We have enough trouble in our own backyard, what with the Lannisters forging half the steel in the Westerlands and Baelish slithering around corners." Margaery nodded, stepping over to a small desk where letters awaited her attention. She picked up one sealed with green wax bearing her father's sigil, Mace Tyrell's. "Father's letter arrived late last night. Word is that the roads from Highgarden to King's Landing are still secure, but he warns there have been suspicious movements among some minor lords in the Reach. They take Tyrell gold in one hand, but they might still remember days when the Lannisters held sway. Father wonders if these lords are being courted, perhaps by envoys from the Rock." Olenna's gaze sharpened. "Oh, that wouldn't surprise me one whit. Tywin Lannister spares no expense when it comes to undermining us. But these lesser lords in the Reach should think twice. The rose is in bloom here at the Red Keep, and we have the king's ear. If they choose to conspire with the Lannisters, I hope they enjoy Tywin's coin, because they won't receive a single petal's worth of courtesy from me if they land on the wrong side of history." Margaery exhaled a quiet breath. "We must remain vigilant. I'll pen a reply to Father. Our presence in King's Landing is one thing, But we should see if we can host some of those uncertain lords in the capital, flatter them a bit, remind them where true power lies. Perhaps a harvest feast or two, an event that underscores the closeness between the crown and the Tyrells. A thoughtful pause. Or we might go to them instead. A progress through parts of the Reach might put them in a more receptive mood. Show them that the king and queen do not neglect any corner of the realm. Olenna sniffed. Traveling all the way to the Manor for the sake of entertaining a few half-faithful lords? You'll wear yourself thin. But... She tapped her fingers on the arm of her chair, as if weighing the pros and cons it might have merit. Besides, a progress would let you show off that sweet child, garner some goodwill. Everyone likes to fuss over an infant, especially a royal one. Nothing like the sight of a dear little princess to warm hearts that might otherwise stray. The corners of Margaery's mouth lifted. Perhaps. I'll consider it. But first, I must see to the daily business. She approached a small silver bell and rang it. A moment later, a servant appeared, bowing low. Pray inform the king's steward I'll be in the council chambers within the hour, and have the maester bring any new correspondence from the north. She paused. Also let the septas know my daughter will need additional watchers this morning. The servant bowed and departed. Olenna rose, leaning upon her cane. Very well, my dear, but do try to slip in a moment to eat. You can't prop up the entire realm on an empty stomach. She left Margaery's solar with a sharp click of her heels, as though she owned the Red Keep more thoroughly than Robert himself did. Margaery exhaled in quiet amusement. Her grandmother's brusque manner could charm or cut, depending on the target. But Margaery was grateful for her presence. Olenna Tyrell had taught her from a young age that power, once seized, must be gently cultivated, never taken for granted. She intended to do precisely that. An hour later, Margaery swept into the small council chambers. Renly Baratheon was already there, leaning back in a chair, clad in green velvet that made him look every bit the charming courtier. Baelish Peter, as he was called by some, sat with hands steepled, his hazel eyes bright with cunning as he spoke quietly to Varys, the master of whisperers. Pycelle was absent, rumored to be abed with a cough, though Margaery had her doubts about how real that ailment was when it suited him to vanish. As Margaery entered, both men rose, bowing. Renly gave her a warm smile. Good morrow, sister. Margaery, Littlefinger purred. You bring sunlight to this dreary chamber. We were just discussing the matter of debts owed to the Iron Bank. His cunning smirk did not fade as he resumed his seat. Varys fluttered his sleeves in a show of humility. Your Grace, you do us a great honor by attending these discussions. You must forgive the dryness of the topic, but we cannot avoid the crown's obligations. Margaery inclined her head, taking the seat at the table that once belonged to Cersei. She had had the old seat reupholstered, so the Lannister crimson was replaced with an understated tapestry of black and gold. A subtle gesture, but a clear one. Let us speak openly, then. We all know the crown's finances remain delicate. Even though House Tyrell has contributed funds to ease the burden, and certain terms with House Lannister have been negotiated, the realm still has outstanding loans. What news from Bravos? Renly lifted a parchment. The Iron Bank is growing impatient, as is their wont. They demand regular payments as well as interest. They talk of penalizing the crown with new fees if we delay further. Littlefinger cleared his throat. I have been in contact with some Bravosi envoys who might be willing to renegotiate under more favorable terms, provided we offer them certain trade advantages through King's Landing. The dispute, as always, is that they want ironclad guarantees we won't default the moment we're preoccupied with other matters, like the possibility of war. Margaery's face remained serene, though inwardly she weighed the potential for friction if the crown made such trade concessions without the Lannisters' gold. We must tread carefully. The Iron Bank will not hesitate to fund any rival claim if they think our throne unstable. We've seen it before throughout history. Renly nodded, his tone calm. Fortunately, the capital is calmer these days, with the supply lines from the Reach ensuring we don't face immediate unrest from the hungry smallfolk. That stability might appease the Iron Bank. Littlefinger leaned in, speaking smoothly. And your father, Mace Tyrell, might be persuaded to contribute a touch more gold in exchange for certain privileges, perhaps a broader control of the shipping routes up the Mander, or extended influence over the crown's grain storage. A small price to pay to keep Bravos pleased, no? Margaery offered him a polite smile. She was well aware that Peter Baelish often tried to pit lords against each other for his own benefit. I'll consider how best to approach my father. But let us remember that while the Tyrells are loyal, we cannot always be the only wellspring of coin. We must foster stability across all regions so that trade flourishes. The crown's wealth will rise with a robust economy, not merely with tributes from our banner houses. Varys's soft voice interjected. Your Grace, if I may, my little birds hear that the Targaryen exiles have grown emboldened in Essos. Viserys Targaryen, though somewhat erratic, is rumored to have forged a marriage alliance for his sister. A Dothraki call, if whispers are to be believed. Should they ever unite the Dothraki under a single banner and attempt an invasion, or if they seek Bravosi coin to reclaim the Seven Kingdoms. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. It may prompt the Iron Bank to reconsider who holds the throne, especially if they see Robert's reign threatened by an external force. You know how the Iron Bank loves a stable investment. A prickle ran along Margaery's arms. She glanced at Renly, saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. Robert's hatred for the Targaryens was the stuff of legend. He had never truly let go of his fury over Lyanna Stark's death, nor the entire war that had put him on the throne. If the Targaryens were to pose a genuine threat, it could reignite Robert's oldest, darkest obsessions. Still, Margaery had gleaned enough from the last year to know that the Dothraki rarely posed a serious threat if they had to cross the sea. The real question was whether foreign bankers or mercenary companies might sponsor a Targaryen return. She exhaled slowly. We must remain watchful, but panicking over rumors serves little purpose. We have had these same whispers for some time now, and the Dothraki have not yet sailed. They loathe ships if the stories hold true. That said, I propose we increase trade with the free cities. More commerce, more alliances, less reason for them to bankroll an invasion. If the Targaryens do attempt such a thing, perhaps we can sway the free cities to stand aside, or even to hinder them. Renly inclined his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. You see, Littlefinger? Our queen is not so easily spooked. Peter offered a wry bow. Indeed not. I yield to her grace's wisdom. Margaery nodded. Very well. Let us proceed with negotiations with the Iron Bank. Offer them moderate trade privileges, not so extensive as to compromise the crown's authority, but enough to show we honor our debts and mean to repay in full. If it comes to it, I will speak with my father about contributing more coin, but only as a last resort. So the meeting continued, each piece of the realm's precarious puzzle laid out. Finances, alliances, rumors of Targaryen movements, the uncertain loyalty of certain lords in the Reach, and the persistent chill that seemed to spread from the north. In the end, no final solutions emerged, just a pattern of small steps meant to maintain the balance. By the time the discussion ended, Margaery felt a dull ache at her temples, the weight of the crown pressing down as heavily as any circlet of gold. She took her leave with graceful composure, mindful that outward composure was often half the battle in politics. That afternoon, she convened a private audience with Lord Stannis Baratheon, who had arrived in King's Landing the previous day. Stannis, grim-faced, rigid, every inch the unyielding second brother, had seldom been seen at court since Robert's wedding to Margaery. He spent much of his time at Dragonstone, no doubt nursing resentments. Still, he had answered the king's summons. In the small reception hall hung with Myrish carpets, Margaery sat upon a modest seat while Stannis stood before her, face like carved stone. Lord Stannis, Margaery greeted, dipping her head courteously. She chose not to address him as brother too casually, knowing Stannis's temperament. I trust your voyage from Dragonstone was uneventful? His lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, your grace. The seas were relatively calm. He paused, then cast a stiff glance at the tapestries around them, as if searching for any sign of subterfuge. The king summoned me, but I have not yet had the pleasure of his presence. I was told you wished to speak first. Margaery gave a measured nod. Indeed, the king is occupied with other duties at the moment, so he asked me to welcome you and to discuss certain matters on his behalf. He'll see you privately later. I hope that is acceptable. Stannis said nothing, though his jaw tightened. He was a man who believed in protocol and found it vexing when matters deviated. But he was no fool. He knew Robert was king, and that Margaery was queen by royal decree. He must abide. Very well. She folded her hands in her lap. Dragonstone is a strategic holding. We rely on its defenses to safeguard Blackwater Bay and the route to King's Landing. The king wishes to be certain that we have your full support in maintaining these waters, especially in light of potential threats from Essos. Should the Targaryens or any Selsails attempt to land, we must ensure the crown's strongholds are prepared. Stannis gave a curt nod. My loyalty is not in question. I hold Dragonstone in the king's name. Should any foreign fleet appear on the horizon, they will find no welcome in our seas. He paused. Yet I wonder if the king has given thought to the royal fleet's condition. The ships are old, many in disrepair. If we are to keep watch effectively, we need more than words of encouragement. We need resources to build new war galleys, to refit the existing ones. He was right, of course. The royal fleet was hardly the mightiest in Westeros. Margaery had heard the complaints from Davos Seaworth, Stannis's loyal man, who had once or twice written to the Red Keep about funds to bolster the king's navy. We are aware, Margaery said gently. The crown's coffers are not as bountiful as we would wish. But we are working to rectify that. Perhaps if negotiations with the Iron Bank go well, we can direct some portion of the capital toward the fleet. Until then, I hope we can rely on your resourcefulness, Lord Stannis, in maintaining a vigilant defense. His eyes flicked to hers. If I must mend the ships with my own coin, I shall do so. But it ought to come from the crown. The realm depends on it. Margaery inclined her head. I shall present your request to the king again and advocate for stronger naval support. For now, he bids me to assure you that your guardianship over Dragonstone is highly valued, and we remain grateful for your service. Stannis's features did not soften, yet a touch of grudging acceptance passed over his stern face. Very well, your grace. I shall speak with Robert when he is ready. He paused, a hint of wariness creeping into his voice. I hear the capital is changed since your marriage. They say the king is calmer than before, that the city no longer starves so easily. A good sign, perhaps. Margaery offered him a sincere smile. We strive to serve the people. If we can maintain alliances and keep the realm fed, that is half the battle. The other half is ensuring no external force topples us. Dragonstone is part of that equation. Stannis nodded once, then straightened. Without further ado, he took his leave, the clack of his boots echoing in the corridor beyond. Margaery wondered how Renly fared with this grim elder brother. Renly was so gregarious, while Stannis had the warmth of an iron gate. Still, if the Baratheon brothers could find common ground, it would only strengthen the king's hold on the realm. She mentally added that to her growing list of concerns. As the weeks passed, King's Landing settled into a rhythm of cautious optimism. The harvest had been decent, and with the Tyrell supply lines, the city was well provisioned heading into winter. Craftsmen from the Reach set up shops in the lower wards, selling their wares. The gold cloaks, under a commander chosen by Renly, managed to curb some of the worst crimes. More merchants arrive daily from all over Westeros, lured by the sense that the capital was no longer a powder keg awaiting a spark. The small folk, who cared less about alliances than about surviving the winter, found themselves better fed than in years past. It didn't make them rich or pampered, but it soothed the undercurrent of discontent that had plagued the city. Margaery seized this moment of relative peace to further secure her personal circle. She invited various ladies of the court to afternoon teas in the Queen's Gardens, a small orchard just behind the Red Keep where lemon trees and twisted vines created cozy bowers. Lady Sansa Stark, still betrothed to nobody in this timeline, for Joffrey was no longer the crown prince, became something of a companion, wide-eyed and eager to learn courtly ways. Margaery took the girl under her wing, teaching her discreetly how to engage in polite conversation without revealing too much. The Starks, for their part, had never parted from the crown under acrimonious terms. Ned Stark remained Warden of the North, sending polite missives expressing cautious support. Margaery knew that cultivating a positive relationship with Sansa might pay dividends if, someday, the North's strength was needed. She also ensured that lords from the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands were given favorable receptions, so that they might carry glowing reports back to their kin. The Lannister threat, she perceived, was best contained by ensuring the rest of the realm found no reason to side with Tywin. Let him seethe and brood at Casterly Rock. As long as he stood alone and the crown was not too overextended, a direct uprising might never come. Meanwhile, word from Dorne suggested a new dynamic. Prince Doran Martell extended a guarded olive branch. He hinted at re-establishing strong ties with the Iron Throne if certain considerations were made regarding Dornish autonomy. With the Lannisters diminished in courtly power, Doran's hatred, rooted in the murder of Elia Martell and her children, no longer seethed quite so hotly against the crown. That fury had been aimed more at the Lannisters than at Robert personally. Margaery recognized an opportunity. She encouraged Robert to send an envoy, perhaps even inviting Prince Doran to King's Landing for a festival. Robert was reluctant. He disliked the Southron climate and found the Dornish pride galling. But eventually he was persuaded, especially after Renly pointed out how useful a Martell alliance might be in staving off the Targaryens or the Lannisters. There were nights, however, when Robert's old demons stirred. Sometimes he returned to the keep stinking of ale and sweat, his eyes haunted by the memory of Lyanna Stark. He would slump in a chair, muttering about the rebellion and the what-ifs that consumed him. Margaery would sit by him, a gentle hand upon his knee, and let him speak his sorrows. He ranted about Rhaegar, about the Targaryen heirs who might lurk across the sea, about the lies and betrayals that had shaped his path to the throne. But with Margaery's calm presence, these outbursts rarely escalated into violence as they once might have. He would drink himself nearly insensible, then rest, and come morning, he was again the king, determined to secure the realm for his new family. It was not a perfect transformation, but it was better than the days when he brooded alone, with Cersei's cold contempt fueling his rage. Their daughter grew steadily, her hair dark as charcoal, her eyes the color of fresh chestnuts. Margaery found in the child a wellspring of hope. Each time she held her, or watched her attempt to grasp at toys, or heard the baby giggle at some passing shadow, she remembered why she endured the labyrinth of politics. The child bore no official name yet that had been revealed publicly. Robert and Margaery still debated it. Margaery wanted a name reminiscent of either Baratheon or Tyrell lines, or perhaps even honoring someone from Robert's old circle. But Robert kept suggesting powerful, martial names for a girl, half in jest, half in memory of the warrior queen he wished she might become. Still, the realm's people referred to her as the Little Stagrose, and that was enough for the moment. Already, courtiers lavished the infant with gifts, desperate for the queen's favor. Margaery accepted them graciously, taking care not to show undue favoritism. Tensions with the Westerlands, however, never vanished. Tywin Lannister's forging of arms continued unabated. Reports from traveling merchants and mercenaries confirmed as much. He was building a stockpile of steel, crossbows, and siege equipment, far beyond what one might expect for routine defense. Robert raged whenever fresh news of Lannister militarization arrived, calling Tywin a traitor. But Margaery and Renly counseled caution, pointing out that Tywin had made no overt moves. If the crown marched west unprovoked, the realm might see it as tyranny. Better to wait until Tywin made an unmistakable aggression. In truth, the king's forces were stronger than they had been in years. House Tyrell alone could field a huge army, and the crown's alliances now included Stormlands, many Reach Lords, and River Lords who had little love for the West. Yet a war would be devastating, no matter how many men the Tyrells could muster. The farmland of the Reach could be pillaged. The roads would run red with blood. Margaery feared that an open conflict might only weaken the realm to the point where a Targaryen invasion could succeed. So they waited, maintaining an uneasy watch. When the first snows dusted the fields north of the Trident, Ned Stark arrived in King's Landing, accompanied by a small retinue of guards and his daughter Arya. It was said that Ned wanted to speak personally with Robert about certain matters of the Night's Watch, and to assess the Crown's stance on the rumored threats beyond the wall. Ned Stark was not a man prone to flights of fancy, so Margaery suspected the rumors troubled him more than he let on. A feast was held in Ned's honor, a more subdued affair than the riotous tournaments of old, but pleasant all the same. Margaery ensured a table was laid with fresh bread, roasted game, and spiced wine. Arya Stark, still a spirited child, was far more interested in exploring the castle corridors than in sitting through formalities. Margaery caught glimpses of the girl trying to slip away behind pillars, Sansa chasing after her, both of them laughing. For a moment, Margaery felt a pang. She thought of her own child someday growing up amid these stony halls, forging friendships or rivalries with the realm's great houses. She prayed it would be the former. She sat across from Ned at dinner, while Robert sat at the head of the table, enthroned in a plush seat that gave him an unintentional air of grandeur. Between mouthfuls of boar, he engaged Ned in talk of old battles, the rebellion, the days when they fought side by side. Ned, more subdued, answered politely, though Margaery sensed something weighing on him. Eventually, the conversation turned to the Night's Watch. "The Watch has always held the North's respect," Ned said, "but their numbers dwindle. More wildlings cross the wall each year, fleeing something they claim is far worse than anything we've yet seen. They speak of white shadows, of whites, of the others. I know many in the South find such tales preposterous, but the Watch is uneasy. They seek more men, more supplies. The Crown's taxes do not reach them in the ways they need." Robert, half drunk but still coherent, waved a hand. "The old stories, Ned. Frost demons and giant ice spiders. Children's fables. The wildlings are probably just hungry or wanting new land." Ned's jaw tightened a fraction. "Hungry, maybe, but for them to cross in such numbers? The Watch says entire camps have emptied. If something stirs out there, we should be wary." Renly, seated nearby, sipped his wine. "We have no proof these White Walkers are real, and the realm's resources are stretched. We're not in open war, but we have heavy debts. The king can't send wagon loads of gold north on a mere rumor." Margaery interjected with a calm tone. "But the safety of the realm depends on vigilance. Perhaps a middle course, sending a small portion of gold for supplies, or new recruits from the dungeons here in King's Landing. Criminals can be offered the black. Would that satisfy the Watch for now, Lord Stark?" Ned's gaze flicked to her, respectful but still guarded. "It would help, Your Grace. Any measure of support helps. The Watch must not be forgotten." Robert drained his cup and smacked his lips. "Very well. We'll send some men from the dungeons, worthless scum that they are. They can freeze on the wall if they like. And a bit of coin. But no more tall tales, Ned." He forced a grin, trying to lighten the mood. "We have real enemies closer to home." Ned nodded, though a faint shadow lingered in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace." He glanced at Margaery. "I appreciate your counsel. The North does not forget those who show concern for its defenses." Margaery inclined her head. "We serve the entire realm. Let us hope these wildling stories remain mere rumors. But better to be prepared than to be blindsided." The feast continued, though the talk shifted to lighter topics. Ned inquired after Margaery's child, and she smiled warmly, describing how the babe had begun to grip at the curtains, as if trying to stand. The fatherly softness in Ned's gaze suggested he thought well of Margaery's maternal devotion. All in all, the evening ended on a cordial note. Still, Margaery could not forget the sense of unease that clung to Ned like a cloak. She wondered if his instincts were sounding a warning the rest of them were too far removed to heed. After Ned's departure, the winter rains came, turning the roads around King's Landing to muddy slush. Travel slowed. Margaery used the respite from visitors to spend more time with her daughter and to continue forging relationships with the noblewomen who resided permanently at court. She hosted small gatherings in the Queen's Solar, weaving polite conversation with the ladies, especially those from lesser-known houses who might once have been overshadowed by the Lannisters. Many came bearing minor gifts or petitions. Margaery listened attentively, offering small kindnesses. A letter of recommendation here, a promised introduction there. Through such gestures, she planted seeds of loyalty among the lesser houses that formed the foundation of the crown's day-to-day governance. At one such gathering, she noticed Lady Tanda Stokeworth fidgeting, her expression anxious. When Margaery inquired if all was well, Lady Tanda revealed that her younger daughter, Lollies, had nearly been abducted by a pair of ruffians on the city streets. Tanda worried that the guardsmen did not take it seriously, as the men were unknown. Margaery's brow knitted in concern. She promised to speak with the commander of the Gold Cloaks and with Renly to ensure such incidents did not become common. Then she offered Lollies a seat near her, speaking soothingly, coaxing out details. Lollies was shy, easily frightened, and Margaery realized how a single incident could have severe repercussions for a family's sense of security. She made sure to follow up, quietly instructing the Gold Cloaks to investigate thoroughly. If there were men preying on noble daughters in the city, it must be stamped out. The prestige of the crown partially depended on making King's Landing at least somewhat safe for highborn and small folk alike. Such were the mundane but essential tasks that occupied Margaery's days in these quieter months. Ensuring roads remained policed, hearing out petty disputes, managing the delicate tensions in the small council, continuing to correspond with her father in Highgarden and with other lords scattered across the realm. The king, for his part, spent time holding court, hearing petitions in the Red Keep's throne room. He doled out judgments with a surer hand than before. When he grew weary, he sometimes asked Margaery for her perspective, something that had been unthinkable under Cersei's reign. The small folk soon learned that if they approached the throne with some humble request, repairs to a broken aqueduct, justice for a crime, and if they framed it in terms that the queen might champion, they had a better chance of success. It was not that Margaery undermined Robert's authority. Rather, that she tempered it, ensuring his ferocity was not unleashed in petty matters. The city saw results. Fewer beggars starved in the streets, for the harvest was adequate. The orphans had fresh bread in winter. Vendors could move produce without fear of random riot. Of course, King's Landing remained a dirty, crowded metropolis, rife with hidden cruelty. But from the vantage of many inhabitants, things had improved. As winter's grip hardened, ravens arrived from across the sea with news that caught Margaery's attention. Daenerys Targaryen, the last known daughter of King Aerys, had borne a child of her own, a boy, rumored to have been named Rhaego, by the Dothraki father's decree. Whether this child truly had the blood of the dragon, or if the savage horse lords would rally behind him remained uncertain. But the rumor alone was enough to reawaken Robert's simmering hatred. When Varys reported the rumor to the small council, the king erupted in curses, tossing aside his goblet of wine so forcefully it shattered on the floor. He demanded that every spy, every assassin, be dispatched to Essos to ensure no Targaryen child ever set foot in Westeros. Margaery immediately felt a cold dread coil in her stomach. This was the man Robert had been before he married her. The man consumed by Targaryen ghosts, so fixated on vengeance that he'd forget the realm's more immediate concerns. Cautiously, she laid a hand on his arm. "My king, let us think carefully. We cannot risk open condemnation from the free cities. If we send killers after a Targaryen mother and child, we might provoke a backlash that unifies Essos against us. The realm is not prepared for another war, and we have Lannister tension enough at home." Robert glowered. "You'd have me do nothing? When a silver-haired whelp in the east births a new threat to my throne." His voice rose, echoing off the stone walls of the council chamber. "We should have finished them all years ago." Renly cleared his throat, glancing at Margaery for a clue on how to proceed. "Brother, the Targaryens have been across the sea for more than a decade. They've not managed to cross. The Dothraki fear ships, everyone knows that. Perhaps the threat is less dire than you suppose." Robert's fists clenched. "You think I'm a fool, do you?" He shot Renly a furious look. "I know what Rhaegar did. I know how House Targaryen once called dragons from the sky. They may not have dragons now, but if these Dothraki can be convinced to sail, or if Bravos or Pentos chooses to sponsor them, 7 hells, we can't let them grow stronger. He turned to Varys. We have gold for spies. Use it. I want to know everything. If there's a chance to strike at them discreetly, do it. Varys bowed, his expression unreadable. It shall be as you command, your grace. Margaery met the king's fierce gaze. I only caution that we do so carefully. A miscalculation could spark an alliance of free cities against us. That would leave the realm vulnerable to the west and to the Targaryens. Let us move in shadows if move we must. The king, chest heaving, finally gave a single curt nod. He dropped back into his seat with a snarl, as though warring with old ghosts. Fine, carefully but effectively. I won't have Targaryens rising again. I won't allow it. The rest of the council remained silent, letting Robert's anger cool. Eventually, he dismissed them, and Margaery followed him out, stepping carefully over shards of the broken goblet. She could feel the tension in his stride, see the memories flickering behind his eyes. The war that had shaped him, the love he lost, the vendetta that still burned. She did not know if she could ever truly banish it from him, but she could try to guide it so it did not consume the realm. That night, when they were alone, she sat at his side in their bedchamber. He drank in sullen gulps, staring at the dying embers in the hearth. At length he spoke in a low, hoarse whisper. I dreamed of her again. Lyanna. Margaery didn't flinch. She had grown used to his confessions. He continued, She was calling to me from a tower, but I couldn't reach her in time. Rhaegar was there, wearing rubies on his armor, laughing as she faded away. He closed his eyes. Do you ever dream of people you've lost? Margaery's throat felt tight. In truth, she had not lost many loved ones. Her family was largely intact, and she had been too young to truly grieve the casualties of the rebellion. But she did remember the occasional friend from childhood who died of illness, or lost an older relative to the great spring sickness in the deeper past. Yes, she answered quietly. But the memories fade over time. Sometimes they return, unbidden. We cannot banish them, but we can shape how they guide us. Robert exhaled a shuddering breath. Lyanna would have hated what I've become, he muttered. Drunk and angry, she was fierce. Had a will like steel, Ned always said. Yet the Targaryens took her from me. Margaery's hand slid into his, entwining their fingers. The Targaryens that remain across the sea had no hand in Lyanna's fate. They were babes at the time or not even born. Punishing them for Rhaegar's sins might not ease your loss. His face hardened again. They're Targaryens, he insisted. That blood is tainted. I won't let them come for my throne. I'd sooner see them all dead. She realized she was treading on the edge of his deepest wound. Yet she held firm, her voice calm. Then let us do so in a way that does not bring the realm to ruin. That is all I ask. He stared at her, then gave a tired nod, as though the fight had drained from him. Yes, you're right. We'll be careful. But we'll be rid of them, mark my words. She swallowed her uncertainty and leaned her head against his shoulder, letting him find what comfort he could in her presence. Even as she did, her mind churned. If the Targaryens truly mounted a threat, war might ignite across the sea. If Tywin Lannister sensed an opportunity, he could strike from the west. Then Dorne might consider retribution for Elaya's death if they suspected the crown was weak, or might side with the Targaryens if it meant vengeance against House Lannister. The entire realm would be caught in a storm of claims and counterclaims. Margaery prayed that the day would not come, but she could not deny the possibility, so she resolved to prepare as best she could. Spring arrived late, with the first crocuses poking through muddy soil in the crownlands. By then, the realm had grown used to the idea that Queen Margaery was no passing fancy. She was queen indeed, with a daughter to show for it. More significantly, she had begun to mold kings landing into a capital that functioned more smoothly than in years past. The king's mood, while not stable, was at least tempered by new responsibilities. The short winter had not been harsh, but it had been chilly enough to remind everyone that the cycle of seasons could shift unpredictably at any moment. Late one afternoon, Margaery decided to take her daughter out into the Queen's Gardens for fresh air. A pair of Kingsguard knights, newly appointed by Robert to replace the Lannisters' men of old, trailed behind at a respectful distance. Ser Garland Tyrell, her cousin, a capable knight, and Ser Lothier Brune, a steely-eyed fighter of common birth elevated by Renly's recommendation. Margaery carried the child against her shoulder, murmuring gentle nonsense to coax laughter. The baby, now a robust toddler of nearly a year, had begun to babble sounds that could almost be words. She found a bench nestled beneath a flowering lemon tree, blossoms not yet in full bloom, but fragrant enough to remind her of Highgarden. Carefully, she sat, placing the child in her lap. The baby reached up, pudgy fingers grasping at a dangling strand of her mother's hair. Margaery smiled, a rush of warmth filling her. Sometimes, in these quiet moments, she marveled at how the entire realm might revolve around such small joys. Yet not even the garden could remain free from politics. After a few moments of contented cooing, Margaery noticed a figure approaching along the gravel path. It was Petyr Baelish, moving with that perpetual air of easy confidence. He stopped at a respectful distance, inclining his head. "Your Grace, I hope I'm not intruding. I was admiring the new blossoms. They remind me of your own blossoming influence." Margaery arched a brow, meeting his gaze. "A flowery compliment, Lord Baelish. I trust you've come with more than just flattery?" He offered a half-smile. "Alas, you see through me as always. I do have some tidings that might interest you. Word has reached my ears of Tywin Lannister's continued investment in mercenary companies across the Narrow Sea. There's talk of certain units of the Golden Company, once sworn to the Blackfire Pretenders, receiving fresh gold from unknown sponsors. We cannot confirm Tywin is behind it, but the gold in question traces suspiciously back to the Westerlands." Margaery's pulse quickened. Mercenaries across the sea? Perhaps Tywin intends to keep the Targaryens in check himself, or use them against us. Baelish shrugged languidly. "The possibilities are endless. Perhaps he means to sow chaos, or perhaps he's simply hedging bets in case Essos does become a battleground. In either case, he's spending a great deal, and spending that much coin almost always precedes a bigger plan." The child in Margaery's lap fussed, as if sensing her mother's tension. Margaery patted her daughter's back softly. "I appreciate the information. Do you have any sense whether Tywin is courting the Targaryens, or planning to fight them?" Peter's eyes glittered. "Information is never absolute, especially so far from King's Landing. But rumors suggest the Targaryens themselves are forging alliances among the free cities, Pentos perhaps, or Karth. If Tywin can drive them into conflict with us at precisely the right time, then a weakened Iron Throne might be ripe for a Lannister conquest from the west. Or, if he truly despises the Targaryens, he might simply be aiming to sabotage them before they can land. It's guesswork, I'm afraid." Margaery frowned. "Thank you for bringing this to me. I assume you've informed Varys." "Oh, the spider likely knew before I did," Petyr said in a tone of feigned humility. "But I felt you should hear it directly, Your Grace. After all, if you remain at the center of the king's confidence, it's wise for me to keep our channels open." She recognized the subtext. Petyr Baelish had his own ambitions, always. He courted her favor carefully, never missing an opportunity to remind her that knowledge was power, and that he was happy to trade knowledge if it advanced his position. She had no illusions about his loyalty, but for now she had need of his cunning. Margaery dipped her chin. "You have my gratitude. Keep your ears open for more. If Tywin Lannister means to orchestrate a crisis, I want to know before it's too late." Baelish bowed again, his gaze flicking briefly to the child. A flicker of something, curiosity, envy, or simply calculation, passed over his face, then vanished. "Consider it done, my queen," he said, and took his leave. When he was gone, Margaery exhaled slowly. She pressed her lips to her daughter's head, inhaling the sweet baby scent. The child grabbed at the silver clasp of Margaery's gown, babbling an unformed word. Margaery smiled, whispering, "Shoo, all is well," but inside her heart churned. If the Lannisters were indeed funneling gold overseas for mercenary armies, the realm might be caught in a two-front situation. Targaryens pressing from one side, Lannisters from the other. And if the Targaryens truly had a child, Robert would not rest until that bloodline was extinguished. It could lead to a conflagration that consumed all sides. Time moved with agonizing slowness. Each new raven from Essos or from Casterly Rock brought fresh speculation. Robert grew restless, snapping at the small council for updates. The realm at large remained calm. The small folk did not feel the tension yet, for the city still thrived on Tyrell resources and internal trade. Margaery's father, Mace Tyrell, wrote to suggest a grand festival in Highgarden, hoping to display House Tyrell's continued prosperity and lure the king to the Reach. Perhaps the show of unity would reassure those lords who wavered. Robert grudgingly agreed, spurred partly by Margaery's urging. It would be good to remind Tywin that any march from the west would face a well-organized, wealthy, and loyal region. So, in early summer, the royal party set out for Highgarden, a journey that took them along the Rose Road, through fertile lands bursting with wildflowers and golden wheat. Margaery traveled in a comfortable wheelhouse with her daughter, accompanied by Olenna Tyrell and a retinue of guards. Robert rode on horseback with his household knights, preferring the open air despite the summer heat. Renly, who seemed ever more at ease in social festivities, handled much of the vanguard's logistics. Along the route, local lords welcomed the king with small feasts, each seeking to curry favor. The farmland glimmered under the sun, the Mander's waters reflecting rolling hills. Though Margaery had grown up in Highgarden, she still felt a pang of pride for the beauty of her homeland, and she hoped Robert would recognize how valuable House Tyrell's support truly was. The nearer they came to Highgarden, the more lavish the welcomes became. Petals were strewn before the queen's wheelhouse, bards sang ballads of the rose and the stag, and common folk turned out in droves to catch a glimpse of the king, rumored to be less surly since his new marriage, and to see the new princess. Margaery allowed her child to peek from the window, delighting in the sight of peasants cheering. While she knew flattery was ephemeral, it served a purpose. It kept morale high, reminded the people that the crown's alliance with the Reach was beneficial. If war came, these same small folk might be the difference between an adequate harvest and famine. Winning hearts and minds often began with gestures as simple as letting them see the royal family share in their joys. When at last Highgarden's bright walls rose on the horizon, white stone framed by lush fields, Margaery felt her own heart quicken. It had been over a year since she last walked those gardens. She recalled her childhood spent among roses, the sweet hush of the orchard at twilight, the swirling gowns at harvest balls. Now, returning as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms with Robert Baratheon as her husband, felt surreal. She wondered if her father felt the same sense of wonder. Mace Tyrell stood at the gates, draped in fine silks of green and gold, beaming as though the sun itself favored him. A retinue of Tyrell knights, bearing standards decorated with golden roses, formed an honor guard. As soon as Margaery descended from the wheelhouse, her father rushed forward to clasp her hands, tears in his eyes. "My daughter, you grace Highgarden with your presence," he exclaimed, ignoring protocol in his eagerness. Then he spun to the king, offering a theatrical bow. "Your Grace, we are honored beyond words that you have come." Robert, who had endured Mace's pompous greetings before, managed a genuine, if weary, smile. "Lord Tyrell, I trust the harvest here is as fine as always." "Finer," Mace declared, gesturing expansively at the fields. "Thanks to the blessings of the Seven and your wise rule, we have reaped bountifully. Highgarden is at your disposal for the festivities." Robert grunted, eyeing the local scenery. "Festivities? Good. I need a damn break from letters and rumors." Before Mace could continue his flattery, Olenna intervened, planting her cane firmly in the ground. Now, Mace, let's not keep them standing in the sun like gawping fish. Have the king and queen shown inside. And do be sure the nurseries are properly prepared for the princess." Mace reddened slightly but acquiesced, leading the group through Highgarden's main gate. Musicians played a cheerful tune, and the sweet smell of roses wafted on the breeze. Margaery felt a wave of nostalgia. Even Robert seemed less tense here, as if the gentle climate soothed him. Renly, riding in behind them, flashed a grin at the onlookers, always eager to charm. The people cheered, tossing rose petals. Inside, Margaery's mother and siblings gathered to greet her. Her brother Loras wore shining mail under a bright cloak embroidered with roses. He bowed to Robert, then lifted Margaery's hand and kissed it with a playful flourish. "Sister, I barely recognize you as queen," he teased softly. "Though the crown does suit you, you must regale me with tales of King's Landing." She smiled, seeing the flash of mischief in his eyes. Later, Loras. "First, let me catch my breath." She handed her child to a waiting maid, instructing them to settle in the prepared apartments. The festival would last several days, with feasts, justs, and hunts, culminating in a grand ball. Margaery knew her father would spare no expense to impress the king and the assembled lords from the Reach. That evening, a welcoming feast took place in Highgarden's great hall. The chamber was bedecked with garlands of fresh flowers, the air filled with the heady perfume of roses, honeysuckle, and lavender. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted game, fresh bread, spiced wines, and sweet desserts shaped like roses. Minstrels performed lively tunes, and dancers whirled in bright attire. Robert sat at the high table with Margaery, Lord Mace, Olenna, and other Tyrell notables. Loras and Renly exchanged banter with the knights seated nearby. The atmosphere was jubilant, a far cry from the tension-laden banquets of King's Landing. As the feast progressed, Margaery mingled, making polite conversation with various lords who had traveled to see the king. Some expressed delight at how the queen blossomed from Highgarden's fertile soil to grace the Red Keep, while others, especially older lords, offered guarded compliments. Margaery responded graciously to all. She especially took note of those who seemed uncertain about the alliance, employing her keen sense for reading faces. If any lord showed signs of dissatisfaction or half-concealed loyalty to the Lannisters, she took mental note to investigate further. The entire reason for this festival was to reinforce the notion that House Tyrell and the Crown stood united, and that any who chose the Westerlands would be going against the grain of the realm. Late into the night, after the final courses had been cleared, the king declared his intention to lead a hunt the next day. Boars were said to roam the nearby forests, and the hunts in the Reach were famed for their abundance of game. Margaery felt a slight twinge of worry. Robert's last boar hunt had ended badly in some tellings of the future she'd once feared, but that was in a different timeline under different circumstances. She reminded herself that this was not that same scenario. Still, she quietly resolved to ensure the king did not go out so deep into his cups before the hunt. She wanted no accidents on Tyrell lands, especially not now. By the time she retired to her guest chamber that night, her mind swirled with impressions, half-remembered conversations, and the sweet memory of home. Torches lit the corridor in dancing shadows. The child slept nearby in a small cradle, guarded by a maid and a Tyrell guard. Margaery changed into a nightgown and settled before the balcony window, gazing out across the moonlit gardens. Familiar hedgerows, flower beds, the silvered waters of the Mander beyond. She felt both at peace and on edge, for even here the game never truly ended. She heard a firm knock at the door. Standing, she moved to open it, expecting perhaps a servant. Instead, she found Loras, still in partial armor, his hair slightly disheveled. He bowed. "Forgive the lateness, sister. I wanted a word, if you'll permit." She gestured him inside. He entered quietly, shutting the door behind him. Margaery could see the excitement in his eyes. He was a skilled knight, but also young and prone to romantic notions of glory. "Is it about the joust? You'll certainly do well, Loras. You always do." He flashed a quick grin. "Thank you, but there's more. I wanted to speak of politics. I've heard rumors from some traveling knights that Tywin Lannister is, well, building alliances with mercenaries. You'd know better than me if it's true, but if it is, perhaps the time will come when we must face him head-on. And if that happens, I want to be in the vanguard, with the king's banner or yours." Margaery pressed her lips together. Loras's eagerness for heroics tugged at her heart. She remembered him as a boy running barefoot through these halls, swiping a wooden sword at imaginary foes. Now he was a capable knight, but still prone to seeing the world as a tournament with clearer winners and losers. "It may come to that," she admitted carefully, "but I hope not soon. War would devastate the Reach." Loras nodded solemnly. "I know, but the king, I never thought I'd see him so changed. He's still Robert, but it's as if you've given him purpose again. If a war does come, I believe the realm might rally to him more wholeheartedly than it would have a year or two ago. The Stormlands and the Reach united, unstoppable. And if the Targaryens appear, we'll defeat them too." Margaery sighed. "I appreciate your confidence, but do not underestimate Tywin's cunning, or the difficulties of facing an army from Essos, if that does indeed manifest. We must gather allies, not just arms. This festival is part of that effort." He nodded, then took her hand in a brotherly gesture of affection. "I trust you, Margaery. You're far more clever than I. Just know that if you call, I will answer. And so will all our siblings. We stand behind you." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Loras. That means the world to me." Then she gave him a pointed look. "Now go get some sleep. You'll want to be sharp for the joust, no?" He laughed softly. "True enough. Good night, sister." After he left, Margaery paced the chamber, her thoughts drifting to the precarious balance they walked. If war were to break out, her brother and thousands of other young knights would be flung into the maw of conflict. She prayed it would not come to that, but she recognized the realm might not be so lucky. The best she could do was delay the storms, buy time, and hope for a miracle, peace or a stable compromise. Yet in Westeros, compromise was often overshadowed by pride and vengeance. Eventually, she settled into bed, exhaustion claiming her. She listened to the soft sigh of her daughter's breath in the adjoining chamber, letting that lull her into a fitful slumber. Outside, the moon bathed the gardens in silver, a fleeting hush before the next day's pageantry began. Dawn broke, and preparations for the hunt ensued. Robert rose early, surprisingly sober, though he soon demanded wine be brought. Margaery intervened, lightly suggesting that he try a hearty breakfast instead. Perhaps placated by the novelty of the Highgarden kitchens, he agreed. The hunting party gathered in the courtyard, men astride well-bred horses, hounds yapping at their feet. Margaery stood with Olenna and a few ladies to see them off. She caught Robert's gaze, a flicker of reassurance passing between them. He spurred his horse and departed, flanked by Renly and Loras. A swirl of dust, barking dogs, and clattering hooves echoed behind them as they rode out of the gates. For Margaery, the morning promised a different sort of work. She would attend a formal garden stroll with her mother, Lady Alice, and a cluster of noblewomen from the Reach. There would be much talk of betrothals, trade agreements, and gossip about the king's intentions. She donned a light gown of pale yellow and green, letting servants arrange her hair in soft coils. She carried her child in her arms as she stepped into the bright sunshine. The group formed near a fountain in the heart of Highgarden, a cheerful spout surrounded by climbing roses. Lady Alice cooed over the princess, while other ladies complimented the queen on how swiftly she had adapted to her role. As they walked slowly through the hedged paths, Margaery engaged in mild pleasantries, gleaning tidbits about which houses had new alliances or secret strife. Midway through, they stopped for refreshment at a marble pavilion. A young serving girl brought a tray of chilled fruit sherbets, which the ladies took gratefully. Margaery sat, cradling her child carefully, though a maid offered to hold the princess for her. She declined. She preferred to keep her daughter close. The baby reached sticky hands for the sherbet, prompting laughter. "I hear talk that the king might remain in Highgarden for a fortnight," said one of the ladies, a cousin of House Hightower. "He must love our mild climate. Is it true, your grace?" Margaery smiled. "He does enjoy the hunts here, but his duties may require him back in King's Landing sooner. We'll see how events unfold." She always spoke carefully in such gatherings, giving enough to satisfy curiosity but not enough to sow rumor. "Oh, but we'd be honored if he stayed," Lady Alice said brightly, her voice laced with maternal pride. "Perhaps your father can coax him to remain. We do so love having you at home, dear." Margaery acknowledged her mother's comment with a gentle nod but said nothing definitive. Her gaze swept the pavilion, noting the arrangement of ladies, the subtle eavesdropping. It was a standard dance. Everyone wanted a piece of the crown's favor. She offered easy smiles, letting them glean that the queen was approachable yet not naive. Suddenly, a low rumble of voices sounded from beyond the hedges. A guard appeared, out of breath, concern evident on his face. He approached Margaery, bowing. "Pardon, your grace, but a messenger has arrived from the hunt. The king, he's been injured." A hush fell upon the pavilion. The ladies went wide-eyed. Margaery's heart lurched, memories of another timeline pounding in her mind. Her voice caught in her throat. "Injured? How badly?" "Uncertain, my queen. The messenger only said to summon a maester at once. It was a bore. They're bringing him back. He's alive, but..." Margaery didn't wait for more. She thrust the child into her mother's arms, swiftly rising to her feet. Panic flared, but she forced it down. This might not be the same dreadful accident that had once been rumored in old tales. She was here. Things were different. She had to keep her composure. "Gather the maester," she ordered the guard. "Prepare the best chamber for healing. Alert Lord Tyrell and Lady Olenna. Quickly." The guard bowed and hurried off. Margaery turned to the stunned onlookers, forcing a calm she did not fully feel. "Pray excuse me. My husband needs me." Then she lifted her skirts and ran down the garden path, heart hammering. All around her, servants rushed to set the keep into motion. Boar hunts, she thought, with an inn. Ward curse. She had known it was a risk. When she reached the courtyard, another rider had arrived with additional details. The king was conscious but bleeding from a wound in his side. Loras Tyrell was accompanying him, while Renly raced ahead to ensure the route was clear. Margaery's stomach twisted, but she schooled her face into resolute calm. If Robert was conscious, it was not necessarily a mortal wound. She had to believe that. The courtyard gates swung open a short while later, and a small party rode in. Robert hunched over his horse, grimacing in pain, an improvised bandage soaked with blood tied around his middle. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. Loras and another knight supported him as he dismounted. Renly jumped down, calling for the maester. Grooms rushed forward, knights parted ranks. Margaery ran to Robert's side, ignoring decorum. He gave a low, pain-filled groan, leaning heavily on her and Renly. "Damn boar," he slurred. "Caught me off guard. Too many dogs barking. Gods, it hurts." Margaery's breath caught at the sight of the blood. It was not a mere scratch. She had seen enough superficial injuries in tournaments to know that a boar's tusk could rip flesh like a blade. But Robert was still upright, albeit barely. "Bring him inside," she commanded, voice steady. "Now!" The group half-carried, half-led Robert into the castle. Maester Kalman, the local Tyrell-appointed maester, arrived at a run, directing them to a prepared chamber. They laid the king on a broad bed, peeling off his blood-stained hunting leathers. Margaery stood close, her pulse roaring in her ears as she watched the maester examine the wound. Blood still seeped. The maester frowned, calling for wine, cloth, and hot water. Robert groaned in agony, eyes rolling slightly. Loras battered himself with a bruised shoulder, recounted the event in a taut voice. "We flushed out the boar, and his grace loosed an arrow. The boar charged. The king misstepped. His gaze flicked away in shame, as though blaming himself. By the time we took it down, the tusk had caught him in the side. We bound it as best we could." Margaery pressed a reassuring hand to Loras's arm, then ushered him aside so the maester could work. Renly hovered by the bedside, looking pale. Margaery joined him, taking Robert's hand. The king's eyes fluttered, and he focused on her with a pained half-smile. "Gods, sorry," he rasped. Didn't think the bastard had it in him." She forced a small smile, fighting back tears. "Don't speak. Save your strength." She stroked his hair back from his clammy forehead. The maester, with practiced efficiency, poured milk of the poppy into a cup. "He must drink this," he said, his voice calm. "I will do what I can, but the wound is deep. We must clean it thoroughly, suture it, and watch for fever." Margaery lifted Robert's head and helped him swallow the milk of the poppy. His grip on her hand trembled, then slackened as the painkiller began to take hold. She stood back, letting the maester's assistants wash the wound with warm water and medicinal herbs. The sight of torn flesh made her stomach clench, but she refused to falter. She had to be here. That old dread coiled in her mind. If Robert died, what chaos would erupt? Tywin might sense weakness. The Targaryens might exploit it. All the alliances she'd built could shatter. Worse still, she might find herself a widow with a young child to protect, and the realm uncertain who would claim the throne next. She prayed fervently to the Seven that Robert would pull through. He was strong, a warrior. Surely he could withstand a boar's tusk. For hours the maester worked, cleaning, stitching, applying poultices. The king lay in a stupor, occasionally groaning or muttering. Margaery refused to leave, even as Olenna and Mace hovered, offering moral support. Renly stood grim and silent, arms folded. Loras paced like a restless hound, only stilling when Margaery quietly asked him to remain calm. Outside, the midday sun gave way to twilight, servants lighting lamps and placing them around the chamber. The hush was broken by Robert's ragged breathing and the maester's instructions. At last, Maester Kalmon straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've done what I can," he said quietly. "The bleeding has slowed. It's now in the hands of the gods. If he does not develop a mortal fever in the next few days, he may recover. But I must caution you, boar tusks can carry grave infection." Margaery nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She moved to Robert's side, pressing a gentle kiss to his temple. His eyes remained shut, chest rising and falling. She whispered a silent prayer to the mother above. No, she told herself, he must live. I will not lose him. The night that followed was a blur of fear and vigilance. Margaery sat by the king's bedside, forcing him to sip water when he stirred. The maester came and went, changing bandages and applying salves. Renly drifted in, looking exhausted, then out again, muttering about the gods not being so cruel as to steal his brother now. Olenna offered quiet encouragement, while Mace wrung his hands. Loras lingered, then left to attend to his own injuries. Robert burned with fever, sweating profusely, tossing in delirium. Once, in the grip of half-dreams, he seized Margaery's wrist, muttering about Lyanna and the Targaryens. She soothed him, brushing hair from his face. The mention of Lyanna did not sting as once it might have. In that moment, she only felt compassion for a man haunted by a heartbreak that predated her. She murmured words of comfort until he lapsed back into fitful sleep. Each hour felt like a day. Yet, near dawn, the fever seemed to lessen. He sank into deeper slumber, color returning faintly to his cheeks. The maester, checking his pulse, gave a soft nod of relief. He's stronger than I feared. The next day or two will be critical, but I see signs of improvement already. Margaery nearly wept with relief. She thanked the maester, then allowed Olenna to coax her into a short rest. Even as she dozed in a nearby chair, she held Robert's hand, unwilling to let go. Days passed and Robert continued to mend. His pain receded, and the wound began to close. By the time he could sit up in bed and demand ale, a request Margaery quickly refused. Everyone in Highgarden breathed more easily. The king would live. He was weak but alive. Margaery began to see him for short intervals, gently advising him to rest. Maester Kalmon insisted on at least a fortnight before Robert could travel. And the king, while impatient, knew better than to push too hard. The hunts ended. The planned justs were reduced, though Loras still triumphed in smaller matches. The festival turned into a more subdued celebration of the king's survival rather than the lavish display Mace had planned. Even so, local lords voiced their relief, proclaiming the king's perseverance a good omen for the alliance. Many whispered that the queen's presence had saved him, that her prayers had turned away death. For his part, Robert grumbled about being confined to bed. But in quieter moments, he seemed unusually thoughtful, as if the brush with mortality had crystallized something inside him. One afternoon, a week after the injury, Margaery sat by the open window in his convalescent chamber, the summer breeze stirring pale curtains. Robert gestured for her to come closer, clearing his throat. She approached the bed, careful not to jostle him. "Yes, my king," he exhaled, looking down at his bandaged side. "I came close this time," he muttered. "A lesser man would have been gutted for good. If you and that damned maester hadn't tended me, I might be rotting by now." He paused, meeting her gaze with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for staying with me." Margaery offered a soft smile. "Of course." His gaze strayed to the cradle in the corner of the room where their child sat, playing with a carved wooden stag. "I might have left you both alone. That's not what I want. Besides, I've spent so long living in the past, Rhaegar, Lyanna, the rebellion. When that boar's tusk ripped into me, all I could think was, I don't want to die with all this bitterness in me." He grimaced as though the admission cost him. I want to be a better husband, a better father." Touched by his sincerity, she leaned in and placed a gentle hand on his. "We have a chance to build a better realm, Robert. You are a strong king, and we can face these threats together." He nodded, though the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed how monumental that task was. "Yes," he said softly, "we must. Tywin, the Targaryens, I won't let them ruin everything we've built. But I have to approach it differently." Margaery squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this. You never were." He looked at her for a long moment, a trace of wonder in his tired eyes. Then, in a rare gesture of tenderness, he raised her hand to his lips. "You're a good queen," he murmured. "Better than I deserved." The child in the corner laughed at her wooden toy, and the moment felt strangely serene. Outside, the Mander sparkled in midday sun. The realm still teetered on the brink of chaos in many ways, but here in Highgarden, for one bright moment, they were just a family. Margaery let that reassurance fill her, a fragile hope blossoming in her chest. She brushed her fingers through Robert's hair, thinking that perhaps near death had reopened a door in him that had long been barred. Still, she knew the world beyond Highgarden's walls had not changed. The Lannisters continued their intrigues. The Targaryens grew in strength across the sea. The realm's debts loomed, and storms brewed in the shadows. But for now, the king lived, and with him lived the possibility of forging a more stable future, so long as they continued to guide him wisely. That, Margaery told herself, was enough to carry on. A fortnight later, once Robert was strong enough to ride in a litter, they departed Highgarden for King's Landing. The visit, though marred by the near tragedy of the boar hunt, had served to reaffirm House Tyrell's loyalty. Margaery's father had insisted on sending additional wagons of supplies north, demonstrating the abundance of the Reach. Word would spread that the Tyrells had welcomed the king lavishly, and that the king had survived a boar's tusk in Tyrell territory, an odd anecdote that might shape future legends. Robert, clad in looser garments to accommodate his healing side, insisted he felt as strong as ever. "I'll be back on horseback in no time," he boasted, but his wince when he shifted betrayed lingering pain. Margaery persuaded him to use the litter rather than jostle his wound on a saddle. He acquiesced, though with grumbling about how kings shouldn't be carted around like old men. Their journey home took a slower pace. Along the way, Margaery occasionally glimpsed pensive looks on Robert's face, as though he was mulling over new resolves. She prayed he would hold onto this humility, this sense of mortality. If it helped him navigate the political storms with more caution, so much the better. When at last they saw the red keep rising above the Blackwater, Margaery felt a complicated rush of relief and trepidation. Home again, into the swirling intrigues of King's Landing. They arrived to a subdued reception. The small folk cheered to see their king alive. Rumors had preceded them, claiming Robert had been near death. His appearance, pale and thinner but still breathing, banished any notion that he'd perished. Renly dispatched heralds to announce that the king had triumphed once again, though a boar's tusk had slowed him. It became a fresh anecdote to feed the city's gossip mills. That evening, after seeing to Robert's comfort in his chambers, Margaery met with her grandmother in the Queen's solar. Olenna eyed her carefully, noting the fatigue in her face. "Well, girl, you've gotten through one crisis. Let's see what the next one brings." Margaery exhaled, sinking into a chair. "We can only pray it won't involve near-fatal hunts," she said lightly, though tension laced her voice. Olenna patted her granddaughter's hand with rare gentleness. "You've done well, child. Keeping him alive was half the battle. Now, if you can keep him from plunging us into a war too soon, that's the other half." Margaery managed a small smile. "I'll do my best, grandmother." And so it went day by day. Robert convalesced, slowly regaining strength, though the wound would leave a scar. The small council resumed its duties, now faced with the usual swirl of letters and petitions, plus new tidings from across the sea. Varys whispered that Daenerys Targaryen's infant son was rumored to be a healthy boy, that the Dothraki Call might push west in search of spoils. Tywin's movements remained obscure, though gold shipments to the east continued, fueling speculation that some grand scheme was afoot. The Iron Bank pressed for more repayment. Dorne sent polite but guarded messages. Ned Stark wrote from Winterfell about wildling raids. 1,000 pieces, all shifting unpredictably. Through it all, Margaery kept her hand on the tiller. She conferred with Renly, with Olenna, with her father via Raven, always seeking ways to preserve the uneasy peace. When Robert flew into one of his rages, whether about Lannister posturing or Targaryen rumors, she soothed him back to caution. In good times, she guided him toward constructive governance, encouraging small improvements to the city's infrastructure or forging alliances with minor houses. Little by little, the realm grew more stable under their joint stewardship. Not stable enough to be unshakable, but stable enough to withstand the next wave of challenges. The child grew stronger, babbling her first words, toddling around the royal chambers with a nurse in tow. Robert doted on her with a fierce protectiveness that was both heartening and bittersweet. Margaery saw in his eyes the father he might have been years ago, had circumstances been kinder. She did not dwell on the ghosts of Cersei's children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, who were exiled to Casterly Rock. She prayed they were unharmed, though she knew from the occasional letter that Cersei's bitterness was a festering wound. Tywin's hush kept them out of the limelight, no doubt biding time for future schemes. Seasons turned again, the cycle of rains and sunshine passing. Margaery took solace in the daily routines, the flowers in the courtyard, the laughter of her child, the occasional nights when Robert laid aside his burdens and simply held her, acknowledging her not as a political arrangement but as a companion. She knew they might never share a grand love story, but their bond, born of necessity and tempered by adversity, had become something more than convenience. He trusted her. In the deadly Game of Thrones, that trust was invaluable. And so the realm waited for Tywin's next move, for the Targaryen across the sea to either sail or remain, for the banking negotiations to finalize, for the storms rumored beyond the wall to either pass or descend. Each day, Margaery rose to greet the swirl of tasks and alliances, determined to keep the crown from fracturing. One slip, one miscalculation, and the entire tapestry might unravel. Yet for all the tension, she felt a quiet sense of purpose. If the child in her arms was the future of the Baratheon line, Margaery would see that child inherit a realm not on the brink of war but on the cusp of lasting peace, or so she prayed. She stood one evening on the balcony of Maegor's Holdfast, looking across the sprawl of King's Landing. Lanterns flickered in windows below, the city alive with 1,000 small dramas. Nearby, a guard coughed softly. The wind carried the tang of salt from Blackwater Bay. Margaery lifted her chin, letting the breeze brush her face. She had come a long way from the sheltered daughter of Highgarden. Now she was queen of the 7 kingdoms, forging a new order in a realm that had been battered by rebellion and strife. In the hush of that moment, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent vow. She would give everything she had to keep the realm united, to ensure her daughter's generation could flourish without repeating the same brutal cycles. Perhaps it was a lofty ambition, but if any man or woman had the will to shape events, it was the one who now wore the crown beside Robert Baratheon, the Stormlord turned father, tempered by near loss and guided by a queen who knew how to harness both diplomacy and compassion. One step at a time, they would keep the wolves at bay, Lannister, Targaryen, or otherwise, and perhaps carve a path to a better fate than history had once foretold. She opened her eyes to the vast sky, the stars gleaming like scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there, Tywin plotted in silent fury, and a silver-haired girl across the sea cradled her own child, unaware how her name ignited the king's nightmares. The night was peaceful, but peace in Westeros was always fleeting. Still, Margaery Tyrell Baratheon resolved that if the storms came, she would meet them head-on, a rose intertwined with a stag, forging a shield for the realm. The game would continue, but she had learned to play it well, and with each passing day, she could sense the possibility that, this time, fate might bend to a different tune. The child within the Red Keep, and the king who had found renewed purpose, stood as living proof that even the most entrenched destinies could be reshaped. So long as she drew breath, Margaery would see that promise through.